We are reopening our case. If people remember, we opened our first case May 10th. This involves property at 134 Babcock Street, and this is an application under Massachusetts laws, Chapter 40B. Perfect timing, Judy.
Do you want to sit here, Judy? Come on up. Hey, everyone, nice to see you again.
There was an interim continuance on June 21st to today's date. Tonight's plan is that we will hear an updated staff report. We will ask for any updates from the applicant. We have Judy Barrett here, who will give us an overview of Chapter 40B. And we will hear testimony from staff, boards, and departments. Did we get responses from everybody, or is anybody outstanding?
There are some outstanding. We're waiting for rubbish plan, for instance.
Right, okay. Okay, so that will be updated as we get whatever's remaining in. We lastly, and I'm hoping to have plenty of time, we'll take testimony from the public. It'll be an opportunity for us to hear the concerns, and if you have positive comments from the public, what I would ask are a number of things. One, please listen carefully to what your predecessors say. We would like this to be a relatively efficient process. So if you agree with somebody that came before you, let us know. But we don't need to hear in full color commentary the same information again. Just point to that person and say, I agree with them. Obviously, if you have fresh information that you think we have not heard yet, or gives us a new perspective on the proposal, we want to hear it. Okay? Start by giving us, anyone who offers us testimony this evening, start by giving us your name and give us your address. There's a microphone near Maria. We ask that you speak into the microphone. Tonight's hearing, just as a reminder to people, we have two methodologies of record keeping. We have Kristen, who is carefully transcribing everything we say. And we are also, as I understand, on Brookline Cable TV, so whenever they play that, and I assume they're playing it now, but I think they play it, or you can access it again if anybody wants to see the hearing again. Other administrative details, Maria?
That's good for now.
Okay, so Maria, I understand you have a staff report. Oh, one more thing. This kid's name is Hussey Zuroff Geller Haverman.
Okay, so I'm just going to, just for Judy's sake. Okay, I'll fix that later and get on with my staff report. I am Maria Morelli. I'm a senior planner in the planning department. As you said, the last time we met was back in May, so it has been a while. And at that hearing, there was a review of the application for completeness. And I did get the outstanding materials. Just want to point out, the site plan does need to be stamped. There is now a scale, not the graphic scale you see, but there is the architect's or engineer's scale on the plans. Do you have a question about the traffic study submitted by Van Ness? As you know, there is an issue before the town concerning any redesign of Babcock Street, traffic calming, bike lanes, etc. Now, the Van Ness traffic study might have been based on an initial redesign of Babcock, which is not approved. So we don't have an approved plan for the redesign of Babcock. In short, according to DPW, any analysis that is done, whether it's the applicant, peer reviewers, the ZBA, should be done on existing conditions. Now, should there be a redesign of Babcock Street during this public hearing, we have approved plans, then we obviously would take that issue up and reevaluate the project in light of the approved plans. But as of now, We just need to confirm that everything related to that traffic study is based on existing conditions and not an unapproved redesign of Babcock Street. Okay. The other thing is regarding peer review schedule. We're just working with some summer vacations, so I would recommend that the next hearing be continued, this hearing, to August 23rd, at which we would cover site and building design peer review with peer reviewer Clifford Bomer. If possible, we would have traffic and parking also that same evening. If not, I'm tentatively scheduling it for August 28th so that they are in close proximity. That might not be ideal, but I will work with schedules. I'm just presenting the information that I have right now so that you can at least update your calendars. Now, we have had a
Hang
rather...
on. Where are we in our schedule? As you know, we have a very strict schedule.
Yes, so this is actually brings me to the next point that I wanted to make. As you know, this hearing was opened on April 13th, okay? And there wasn't anything discussed. It was simply open to meet the statutory requirement of opening a hearing within 30 days of receiving a ZBA application. It was continued to about a month later, May 10th, okay? So we pretty much lost a month there. And then there's another month lost when the planning board's schedule was so full that we could not actually have this particular case on their agenda. So I am recommending to the ZBA that you ask the applicant for an extension to close the hearing from October 10 to at least December 18.
Okay, and you feel comfortable with that date as based on your knowledge today, obviously?
Well, as I said, you know, these things do need to be reevaluated based on a number of factors. It could be that peer review might ask for more information. That can delay or extend the peer review process. Depends on what your charges are to the developer.
Right.
But we have lost 2 months at the onset, and we had, as you know, a 6-month schedule is a very compressed time period for a major impact project.
Okay, Mr. Allen, will your client agree to an extension to continue this hearing to extended date of December 18th?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Robert Allen, 300 Washington Street here in Brookline Village. If it's okay with you, Mr. Chairman, let me get back to Maria in the morning and confirm that.
Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
All right, just a few more items. I wanted to summarize the letters that you have received. So I will be giving a presentation on behalf of the planning board. The planning board did submit a 6-page letter, which you have, and this presentation will be based on their analysis of the proposal. The Preservation Commission also submitted a letter. The police department and fire department submitted letters. The Director of Engineering did comment on stormwater. We don't have a letter in regard to traffic from DPW, but we will be getting one possibly for the next hearing. I have not heard yet from the tree arborist. I wanted Mr. Brady to examine the existing conditions and especially that street tree, which, as you know, any removal of a street tree or damage to a street tree is outside of the purview of the ZBA. And so we're a little concerned about those curb cuts and just wanted him to weigh in to see if he had any concerns or recommendations. So I'm waiting to hear from him in regard to the plans and also the condition of the street tree. And we don't obviously have a rubbish and recycling plan from the project team just yet, so therefore we don't have comments from Patrick Maloney. One thing that I do want to point out that you did receive in early July, you'll notice if you look at the site plan or actually the site visit, which was very telling, it showed the property line. The left property line does cut through surface parking that spans the property at 120 Babcock and 134 Babcock. And that parking there does serve both properties. So the natural question that comes up, will anything that is proposed at 134 Babcock, will it trigger new nonconformities, or based on the past permitting history at the two lots, is there a question of infectious invalidity? And my colleague Ashley Clark took up that research and did an excellent and very thorough job, consulted with not only the building commissioner, reviewed all the plans of the records of the registry, also consulted with town council, and it is the opinion of the planning department, the building department, and town council that this project does not trigger new nonconformities or infectious invalidity at 120 Babcock. The letter explains why, the memo explains why, but in short, 120 Babcock was constructed in 1920 before our current bylaw, which was put in place in 1961. Okay. So unless you have any questions, I will just work on.
Questions?
Go ahead.
Mr. Hussain? Mrs. Zero? Okay.
I wouldn't mind just a brief discussion of the infectious invalidity principle,
Okay.
just for general edification.
Yep. So what infectious invalidity means, at least my understanding, is that if you have parcels that are subdivided and you do something on one parcel that makes the other not non-conforming, it infects that abutting property. And perhaps one of the real estate attorneys might want to flesh that out in more legal terms. But that, in short, is the essence of that. Because we didn't know the permitting history of that area, we didn't know if there were two lots and there was something subdivided where that issue would come up, and that's why we reviewed it. But it doesn't seem to be a case that that area was subdivided. It's the natural question really was, are we creating new nonconformities because there isn't parking on the site at 120? And it appears that most of the parking on the site at 134 is really serving 120 Babcock. So that's just something that we wanted to investigate off the bat.
Thank you.
Thanks. Anything else?
No.
Okay. Thank you, Maria.
You're welcome.
Does the applicant have any updates this time? No. Seeing shaking this way. That means no. Okay. Judy?
Sure. Just go this way.
Sure, you could sit there, Judy. You've got a microphone right there if you want. It's up to
Do
you.
you want me to advance it? Would it help you?
Okay, that's great.
Oh, okay.
There isn't a remote for that, is there?
Not anymore.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
So I'm happy to be here. I haven't been here for a little bit, and my name is Judy Barrett. I am a consultant to the Board of Appeals. Many people haven't seen me before. I tend to be kind of offline consultant to the board or to the staff, and sometimes come to Board of Appeals meetings, but I'm here as a technical assistance consultant to the board. Brookline requested many months ago assistance from a program by the Massachusetts Housing Partnership that provides help to boards of appeal with Chapter 40B comprehensive permit proceedings. And there have been many here, and so we've been through a lot together over the last year. And when there's a new application, I like to sort of come in and do a little bit of an overview of how this process works for the benefit of, re-benefit of board and the benefit of anybody here who may not have been through this before. So you can go ahead and just advance the slide. I'm sort of going to go through 4 points here. This is a little different from what the board's seen before. I didn't want to bore you to death, so I actually consolidated a few things and updated a few things as well. 4 points to cover is just sort of how the application process works and how sort of the review effort with the board and the applicant proceeds, and of course the neighbors and staff and so forth. Roles and responsibilities at different points in the process, the process for reaching a decision, and then there are things that happen long after this board is involved that people might just want to understand how the rest of it works. So go ahead, go right to reviewing the application. Chapter 40B went into effect in November of 1969. I don't know how many people in this room were alive in 1969 or who even remembers 1969. I certainly do. Not because of Chapter 40B, but because of other events that were much more interesting in Woodstock, New York. But essentially, the law provides, the statute is part of the regional planning law. And I think sometimes people kind of forget, we talk about Chapter 40B as this thing, but it's really a couple of sections in the regional planning law, and it's there for a reason. Back in the 1960s, when the law passed, we had a different kind of housing crisis going on in the United States, and we also had cities, including but not limited to Boston, that were dealing with a lot of racial strife. And so the confluence of household formation rates coming out of the baby boom period, veterans coming and going to war, a construction industry nightmare taking place, and then just the racial tensions in the city and the loss of the white middle class, the legislature said, we need to do something here to sort of make sure that there's an equitable balance of opportunity between cities and suburban areas for people of color and people of low income. So the law comes out of that era, and it's part of the Regional Planning Act because the whole premise of this law is to give deference to the regional need for affordable housing. And that is demonstrated in one or more of a couple of ways. One is, and the one that most people are familiar with, which is if 10% of the housing stock in a community is restricted for occupancy by low or moderate income people, and it's subject to some other requirements, and is therefore eligible for the subsidized housing inventory, if you're at or above 10%, or if you meet another standard called the general land area minimum, which is if at least 1.5% or more of the land in your town is occupied by affordable housing, so-called. Or if you have a lot of development activity taking place in the community in a given year, such that there's a considerable land disturbance taking place. In any of those scenarios, the Board of Appeals has the ability to deny a comprehensive permit and have its decision be deemed consistent with local need. And what that means, in simple terms, is that the developer who's not happy with the Board of Appeals decision can't go to an entity called the Housing Appeals Committee and have a high rate of confidence that the decision will be overturned. So if you're under any of these thresholds, then it kind of creates this presumption that there is a regional need for affordable housing that outweighs a number of local concerns. And so the burden on the board is to do this sort of balancing test as it reviews an application for weighing local concerns against that regional need for housing. So we can keep going here. So those are the statutory requirements. Now, over time, the Commonwealth has come up with some ways through regulation, not in the statute, to recognize efforts by communities, or to, I don't use the word protect, to recognize efforts by communities to create affordable housing. And these are called safe harbors. Unfortunately, we're missing the top line on this slide, but that's okay. So the boat is about we're in a harbor and it's safe. One is, does the community have a housing production plan? And your town does, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. If the plan is certified, that creates a certain authority for the board as if the town was at or over 10%. But there are some caveats to that. Another standard is, have you done a lot anyway, even if you don't have a housing production plan? Have you produced a lot of new low or moderate income housing? If you want to get a sense of what does low or moderate income mean, if you think of a household of two and you think of an income of roughly $54,000, that's kind of what we're talking about. So if the town has done a lot to create affordable housing, regardless of whether there's a housing plan, or if you get an application for a development that is very, very big and over a certain number of units, and in Brookline, I always forget what it is, it's 500 something, isn't it now? 524. Then if any of these conditions apply, then the board can decide whether to approve a comprehensive permit or deny it as if the town was over that 10% statutory minimum. So there's these regulatory safe harbors, and then there's the statutory minima, so-called. Why don't we keep going? In Brookline, I had the pleasure of working with this town on that housing production plan last year. It was approved in October of 2016. And so the town was now in a position to say, we're going to try to produce housing under that plan or pursuant to that plan And if we hit a certain number of units in a calendar year, we can go to DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, and request what's called housing plan certification. I don't mean to have my back to you, I'm sorry. Okay. And so, sure enough, the Board of Appeals, working away on several comprehensive permits at the time, in early 2017, between January and March, did reach that number, which is 131 units in a calendar year. And so on March 23rd, the Department of Housing and Community Development said, Brookline, you're absolutely right. You implemented that plan. It's certified now for a year. Whether it actually endures for the whole year kind of remains to be seen. But basically, the state is saying, if you don't lose any unit between now and the 22nd of March next year, then you have this certification status. So any application coming to the board after March 23rd, 2017 is presumed to fall under this potential safe harbor situation. In other words, the board could say, we like your project, we're going to approve it with conditions, or we're going to deny, and that denial would hold as if the town was over 10%. Now, I just want to point out, this is a regulation and it's not tested, but that is what the regulations say. So a community kind of in good faith can say, fine, we're in compliance. Safe harbor applies to new permits, not ones that were already in play. So just that's the background on certification. You're certified through early March next year, mid-March next year. When an application comes to the town, the board has to make kind of three key determinations. And one is this applicant eligible to even be here? And that is either a public agency like a housing authority, or a nonprofit entity like JCHE, or a for-profit developer that agrees to limit their profits, so-called limited dividend organization. So that's one standard, has to be met. Second standard is, does the applicant have site control? Meaning, do they own the property or do they have a controlling interest in it? Person sale agreement, whatever. And is there a determination by a housing subsidizing agency that the project is eligible from their point of view? If you pass all three of those goes and you get to collect $200, you get to be in front of the Board of Appeals. There is a presumption in the regulations that a project eligibility letter essentially asserts that the other conditions are met. So if the subsidizing agency says you're an okay applicant and you've got site control and you meet a number of other criteria that are in the regulations, then you have a right to be here. I'm not going to comment on that except to tell you that's what the regulations say. I know that that's a question in this case. What the applicant has to provide the board, I have to tell you, for all the time I've been doing this, I've never actually seen a complete comprehensive permit application. It drives me absolutely crazy. But there has to be a preliminary plan. So the plan is not the sort of detailed plan that one would get if you were seeking site plan approval from a planning board or certainly a building permit, but a plan that's something more than sketched on the back of an envelope or in the back of a napkin, as the case may be. A plan that actually kind of depicts the existing conditions on the site, what the applicant's proposing, what's around the property, something that the board can look at and say, I get it. Like it or not, I at least understand what you're proposing. There should be preliminary scaled architectural drawings, so you have a sense of how big this building's going to be, how tall it's going to be, what's it going to be in relation to the structures around it. A basic tabulation of how many buildings, what kind of buildings, what's going to be the coverage on the property, how many units you're talking about, how many affordable units you're talking about. If the project involves a subdivision, which isn't all that common, but sometimes it does, then there's supposed to be a preliminary subdivision plan, a utilities plan, how you're going to service this property, how's it going to operate, and then, critically, a list of requested waivers. And this is important because under Chapter 40B, the premise is that the applicant comes here for all of the approvals required prior to a building permit, except approvals that are subject to other state law. So if the applicant needs approval from the Conservation Commission under what's called Chapter 131, Section 40, the State Wetlands Act, the Conservation Commission doesn't give up that authority. But if you have a local wetlands bylaw that exceeds the State Wetlands Act, this board has jurisdiction to decide whether to
allow waivers from the local bylaw. So this board grants a single, unified, so-called comprehensive permit that the applicant needs in order to go to the next level. So you need all that information. This is just a rundown. The board's heard this so many times, they're tired of hearing about it, but part of the reason you opened this hearing when you did is because of that red 30. Some of this is statutory, some of it's not. When an application comes into the town within 7 days, the board needs to distribute it to the local folks who need to start reviewing it, the town departments mainly. There needs to be a public hearing notice advertised, and you folks who are abutters are supposed to also get notice at least 14 days before the hearing, and again, 7 days before. Within 30 days, and this is a statutory requirement, the board must open the public hearing. Must open the public hearing. So if there's any kind of conflict or something going on, the board opens the hearing and then continues it, but it's just absolutely essential. And the reason that's essential is if the board doesn't open the hearing in 30 days and doesn't have the applicant's blessing to extend, then the town is vulnerable to what's called constructive approval, which is the applicant basically gets to take their permit and run. There is a requirement in the statute, in the regulations, that if the town thinks it has if the board thinks it has the ability to deny a comprehensive permit, either because the board believes the town meets one of those statutory requirements or one of those regulatory safe harbors, the board has to notify the applicant within 15 days of opening the hearing. The applicant has 15 days to appeal or decide whether to agree or disagree. If the applicant disagrees and notifies the board, the Department of Housing and Community Development gets involved, and they have 30 days. They always get more time than the local officials do. I don't know why, but they do. 30 days to decide whether the developer or the applicant on the board is on the right side. From that point on, there's 180 days to carry out this hearing process, to review the application, to consider the plans, to consider the input of town departments, consultants the board may hire to assist in the review, certainly from the neighborhood, and so forth. So within 180 days of the hearing proceeding, either from the original opening or the determination of that safe harbor status, the board has, by regulation, 180 days to bring the hearing process to closure. I've never seen an applicant refuse to grant a reasonable extension, but you don't go into this assuming you're going to get one either. So you have to sort of carry the process out in good faith. When the hearing closes, the board has 40 days to file its decision with the town clerk. There's a 20-day appeal period after that. And so that's what that whole sort of string of dates is about. And the 30 the 30 and the 40 are probably the most critical. To anybody who wants to appeal, that 20 is critical. But anyway, those are kind of the key dates. So boards should conduct a site visit as early in the process as possible. It always frustrates me when boards have no idea when they're looking at a plan what the site actually is and what it's around. So the board can kind of understand what is the physical context and the design context of this proposal. Have the building plans, have the site plan in your hands so you can kind of walk around, say where things going to be, and then understand who is going to be most affected by the development, who are the abutters, and what are they going to see, and what are they going to experience, and operationally, how's it going to affect them. Go ahead, Maria. Most boards, and this board certainly has been the same, will hire professional consultants to assist with the review. Brookline is fortunate in that you have a number of qualified people in-house on staff to help with these application reviews. But even in towns that are well-staffed, sometimes it is just helpful to bring in an outside consultant for another set of eyes. Typically, boards will hire someone to look at site civil engineering, environmental sometimes. Environmental can mean different things depending on the site, a review of a traffic study, and a review of design and architecture. If it's necessary, the board can retain a consultant to review the financials on a project, because one of the things the board has to be careful about is if it's going to approve a project with conditions, it needs some assurance that those conditions won't make the project uneconomic. Sometimes you get to the point where you just can't work things out with the applicant, and you bring on a specialist who can look at the so-called the pro forma and say, the applicant's proposal would be made uneconomic if you imposed conditions on it, or no, it would not. The purpose of the consultants is to review what the applicant has submitted, not to do sort of de novo studies. So, you know, you're not asking an applicant to go out and do, a peer review consultant to come in and do something that's not a peer review, because peer review by definition is someone has submitted something to be looked at. Everything is part of the written record of the project, both the applicant's submission and any of the peer review consultant reports. It's important for the board, because of the time clock ticking here, to try to focus in on what is a real issue as early in the process as possible. I think it's important to get the peer review consultants on board right away. You may not necessarily want to activate them until you know you've actually got a complete application, or if something is going to change early on because perhaps the staff internally have looked at something and said this is never going to fly. It's probably a good idea not to get too much going on the peer review, but to move it forward as soon as practical. And I always think it's good for boards to just never really be afraid to ask for more information, because, as I said, often these applications are simply either incomplete or very skeletal, or just kind of missing stuff that isn't intentional on anybody's part, but because someone's now looking at it carefully, saying, well, I need this following information in order to really understand what you're proposing here, to feel empowered to ask for it, and to always ask for graphic kind of graphics that will help to understand how big is this building going to be, what's the massing, and what's its relationship to surrounding properties. Graphics can sometimes really help people see what is hard to interpret in words or in plan view. Sorry that is difficult to read. I'll tell you what it says. Negotiations and work sessions. This is sort of about a process that some towns do and some do not, where there might be what's called a work session going on parallel to, but not in place of, the public hearing. Some boards of appeal will have negotiation sessions with the board. They're to sort of look at a particular issue that might come up in the public hearing. So they'll have this not public hearing meeting to discuss that particular issue. Typically, if there's going to be anything like that, abutters can and probably should be invited. Some boards do not do this. Some boards will say, we want the staff to meet with the applicant instead and come back to report to us. And that is actually the more common thing I see. But the whole point is that some kind of work session that takes place in support of the hearing process really becomes essential if you're trying to make that 180-day period work. Of course, no decisions get made outside this process. This is the only board with authority to make a decision about a comp permit. And so we always sort of say, check with your town council, because I've worked in more towns than you want to know, and every town council has a different view on the advisability of work sessions. So what's been happening here in Brookline is this board has its meetings in this context, and you see what's going on. If there's something, a detailed or technical issue that needs to be worked out, it's typically being done with the staff, who come back and report to the board. Go ahead, Maria. So that 180 days is, moving along, and you've got to sort of make a decision. Go ahead. What the board has to do, and I said this earlier, is to sort of balance the regional need for housing with whatever the local concerns are that surface during the hearing process. And those concerns typically fall into one or more of these buckets: public health, public safety, environmental impact, design, open space, planning, or other local concerns, which is a real catch-all that no one's really defined ever very well, but it's in the law, so we point it out. I guess I just want to make it clear, the statute does give deference to this regional need for housing, which is, the assumption is, if you're below 10% or you're below the 1.5%, that you have a contribution yet to make to addressing the regional need for housing. That the regional need for housing is what drives this entire statute. It doesn't mean the board can't do anything. It doesn't mean the board has no authority. It doesn't mean the board has to give away the store. It doesn't mean the board has to approve every application that comes before it. It does mean that there is burden on the board to satisfy itself that those local concerns either can be mitigated, or if they can't completely be mitigated, are they more important than the regional need for affordable housing? That's that balancing test I referred to earlier. And the sort of weight of the case law on this is that the regional need for affordable housing kind of outweighs everything else. That doesn't mean that always is the case, but it's usually the case. I think that's the most honest way I can explain this. So there is this balancing test, and it's a difficult challenge because the board is working with a preliminary plan, not entirely the sort of details sometimes you would like. It means you end up writing a decision with a lot of conditions in it that get carried out by the staff and the building inspector later. Okay. It's a good idea to not close that hearing until you've at least had a discussion in public like this, so you guys can hear it and the applicant can hear what the likely thinking is about the conditions in the permit, if the board is going to approve it, what those conditions might be. It's really a good idea to make sure that the conditions aren't sort of going to create some problems down the road, or if they are, at least you know what the problems are that are coming. You can discuss potential conditions with the applicant and the public, review the waivers and make sure those waivers are necessary, and that they're granted in a narrow enough way that the applicant's project can proceed without, sort of taking away, everything the town needs to protect itself. So there's always like these deliberation sessions as you get toward the end of this process. And again, that's kind of all, that happens here. So stay tuned. Drafting the comprehensive permit, as I said, the board has three choices. It can deny, it can approve as submitted, or it can approve with conditions. In most cases, what we see is an approval with conditions simply because the denial is so hard to sustain. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that the board can't deny. It's just very hard to sustain. So if you can find a way to approve with conditions, generally that's what you try to do. I'm not trying to tie your hands or whatever. But those are the options. The conditions, if possible, shouldn't make the project uneconomic once in a while, or sometimes that is simply unavoidable, but that's what you strive for. The conditions have to be consistent with those local needs. The board can't sort of impose conditions on the project that fall outside those matters I listed earlier, design, environmental, public health, public safety, and so forth. Board can't simply reduce the number of units in a project for reasons that have nothing to do with those local concerns. So that's kind of the architecture that's the box in which the board is dealing. Appeals by the applicant. If the applicant's not happy with the board's decision, the appeals are made with the Housing Appeals Committee, which is an entity within the Department of Housing and Community Development. Other aggrieved parties, you will go to the Superior Court or the Land Court. If the project does go forward, sometimes they get permitted and they don't even happen, but applicants have to go to the subsidizing agency again for what's called final approval. That can take a long time. It may move quickly. I've never seen it move quickly, but that's beside the point. This is the point when you now do the final engineering plans, the real sort of detailed plans that have to be in hand in order to go to the building department and get a building permit. If the applicant discovers as part of the detailed plan preparation, they should have asked for something, they didn't, or if they need to change their plan because they were operating with insufficient detail, changes to the comprehensive permit lie with this board. If it's a minor change, the board can approve it administratively or simply by saying it's really insubstantial, we don't need to review it. If they think it's substantial, then the hearing process reopens, but only to consider that change. Go ahead, Maria, I'm almost done here anyway. There's all kinds of paperwork that goes on with the aftermath. There's a regulatory agreement that gets recorded with the Registry of Deeds, kind of laying out what the project has to comply with while the subsidizing agency is involved. There are deed riders to protect the affordability of units upon resale. There's a lottery process that takes place to provide people with an opportunity to purchase or rent the affordable units. And any eligibility to do that requires a series of at least income eligibility and often asset status as well. The permit will generally lapse within 3 years if it's not activated. The board can extend prior the permit hasn't lapsed, the board can extend it for good cause. Transfer of the comprehensive permit, the board gets notified but doesn't really have jurisdiction to say yay or nay. That lies with the subsidizing agency, at least by regulation. Inspections during construction may be done by the town, may be done by consultants. It depends on the community. And so that's the overview. I'm trying to really condense it for you guys, but make sure we covered what needed to be.
Judy,
So,
thank you. Can you also touch upon the distinction of issues that are legitimately before the review of the ZBA in its consideration versus things that are not?
sure.
Which is a complicated thing for
It
people
is.
to understand, and I'm talking about the distinction between existing conditions versus issues that are created by the project itself.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, if there is an existing condition, a problem on a street, a problem with a sidewalk, some condition that everybody knows about and everybody's been dealing with, and the town hasn't done anything about it, it's really not the applicant's problem to fix that. If the applicant's going to make things worse, the board is certainly entitled to say, you've got a financial piece of responsibility here for fixing this problem, but it's not 100%. So the town has an obligation to protect its residents and provide safe, decent, neighborhoods and streets and so forth. So if there's a problem that exists, you really can't require the applicant to take full responsibility for addressing it. But certainly to understand what the applicant's percentage of responsibility is important, because that's probably going to become a condition of approval.
And also speak to schools?
Yes, I figured that was going to come up. The board cannot consider fiscal impact in its decision. The Housing Appeals Committee has been really clear about this. There was a decision several years ago involving the town of Amesbury, where the court tried to lay out kind of what's within the purview of the board and what is clearly not. So things like how many children will live there is just not something that this board can take up and shouldn't take. It just can't take it up, can't consider it. So I've actually been there on the Housing Appeals Committee when the Housing Appeals Committee chair firmly said he would not take testimony on school impact. So just know that that's really what the board can look at are those matters I listed. It's public health, public safety, design, environmental, planning, those kinds of things that the board would consider with any other project. I think that's the best way to think about it. The statute doesn't say all that stuff, but what the statute says is you can't treat a Chapter 40B application differently from the way you treat any other application. They all have to be treated equally. So,
How about safety, Judy? Could you talk a little bit about a safety issue that might get past the appeals committee?
oh God, there's no generic answer to that. I mean, if there's a public safety problem created by the project that the project can't address, can't fix, can't be mitigated through the design, redesign, or whatever. I'm imagining that your public safety officials will testify to that effect, and I'm imagining that you will get an independent consultant to come in and look at the situation, because I'm certain you don't want to end up at the Housing Appeals Committee or in a court of law putting only your staff on the line. That typically when you have something, if you have something that you think is probably going to get you in trouble.
Real and identifiable.
Huh?
Real and identifiable.
Real and identifiable. I would certainly encourage the board to make sure that you have adequate independent consulting help to verify that that is the case.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question. There is case law saying that when you balance local concerns with the need for affordable housing, as a town approaches the 10% safe harbor, the balance can tip more in favor of local concerns, thereby implying that, well, if you're at 9.82, it's different than if you were at 8.22. Are there any cases where it actually has made a difference that a town was getting very close to but had not hit 10%?
Well, unfortunately, you're pressing a button with me, because the town that comes to mind is the town of Andover,
Yeah.
which had been over 10%. It's a case I know well. They had been over 10%, and some of their affordable units went market rate, and they fell just under 10%. And swooping in, because Andover is a very desirable town, came to 300-unit rental developments, either of which was going to get the town over 10%, both of which would have them there forever. way beyond my lifespan. And so the board did approve one and denied another, and among other things, made the argument that they not only had done their share, but had done a significant amount of planning to prepare for both housing, which was true, and also to act as a regional employment center, which was true. And the Housing Appeals Committee did not see it that way. So, that was probably the poster child case, in my view, of a community that had done everything right.
To what extent are previous HAC cases binding precedent?
Well, certainly, I think the HAC will sometimes refine its thinking based on particular facts of a case. I mean, they upheld a decision in Middleborough on planning that frankly was nowhere near as strong as the case in Andover. And in my opinion, that's just me, I'm just a planner, I look at these things. And so they kind of tried to refine what they expected in a case in Andover as well as the town of Hanover, kind of concurrent cases, what their thinking was about acceptable planning arguments. I mean, the Housing Appeals Committee sometimes goes too far, as they did in Groton. So I don't know that, I mean, certainly they would look to precedent, like any other, I think, entity would look to precedent. What have they decided in the past and how did they reach those decisions? But I think they also have to kind of look at the facts of the case and say, well, does this really apply?
Okay, thank you.
That's probably a very
So
generic answer.
are you
but-
satisfied with the answer to the question about we're close but not quite there, therefore does our standard of review change?
I see it as each case depends on its own facts as being the answer.
Well, I do. I know. I mean, I agree with that. I think that, the board doesn't have safe harbor for an application that came in before March 23rd. You don't, and you know that. But you still have to balance regional need, because it's not local need, it's regional need for housing against local concerns. You still have to do that.
Thank you. Anything else for Judy? No? Okay. Maria, I understand you're here to review testimony received from town staff and boards.
Right. So I'd first like to offer a presentation on behalf of the Planning Board. I do want to acknowledge my colleague Ashley Clark, who's in California visiting family, otherwise she'd be here. We are working together on this case, and she did put a lot of work into the preparation and our presentation to the Planning Board. What I'm about to offer in testimony to the Zoning Board of Appeals are the comments and the consensus of the Planning Board. I just want to make that clear.
Let's just make sure.
Yes.
Planning Board versus Planning Department. Two
Right.
totally separate things.
They are. So, yes, if you have
Go
any
ahead.
questions. Before I get into this overview, I just want to introduce the Planning Board's comments by stating that the Planning Board does not support the project as designed. They do acknowledge, and they make it very clear that the site is underutilized and can sustain increased density. However, their review of the proposal, and it was a very comprehensive review, leads them to come to the conclusion that the density proposed is excessive. And there are a number of concrete reasons that I'll be explaining and illustrating on their behalf. Some of that has to do with the intensity of use. There are factors that help you assess intensity of use. Are you providing provisions on the site that support the units that are there, the occupancy that's there, the number of parking spaces, for instance, or trash storage? Can you locate that within the building footprint? There might be some site circulation concerns that actually raise traffic hazards, public safety concerns. Those are some of the things that the Planning Board has noted. And certainly one of the biggest issues regards the massing and the impact on abutters. As you can see, the building envelope is really optimized. It's about as, as complete. It really takes up a lot of the lot area and the building height in general. The building envelope doesn't have much in the way of articulation and setbacks to really mitigate that increased density. And there are measurable ways that will have impacts on abutters and certainly on the streetscape and that general character of that particular neighborhood. There's certain modal patterns that have been identified that are very concrete that were also used to judge this proposal against, to see how much of it is actually sympathetic to that neighborhood characteristic and what can be addressed to better integrate the project. So I'm going to break this down into existing site conditions, the neighborhood context. It's been a while since you've looked at the plan, so I will go through the bare bones of the proposal, the plans, the elevations, the site plan, and then really what that design analysis, why there's a strong feeling that the proposed density is excessive for the site. Oh my God. Okay. You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to close. I think I have to close out. No, it's okay. I'm just going to get rid of Judy's stuff here and just see if we can.
It's my safe harbor picture that did it.
Judy, it's all your fault, Judy. Okay, hold on. I have a backup.
We always have to have a million different formats.
Okay, so we'll just sort of. Okay. Okay. So just to recap some basic specs, this is a 62-unit rental residential proposal. 16 of those units would be affordable. 31 parking spaces at ground level garaged. It is located at the Freeman Street Babcock intersection. This is spanning actually an M1.5 and T5 zoning district. Existing site conditions. So this is currently what you see at the site. And this is an older picture that I chose just so that you could see more of the architecture. A lot of the pictures have street trees or any landscaping on the site which obscures the architecture. This is a colonial revival structure that was built probably in the late 1890s. And I believe there are about 4 units currently at this site. And then what you'll see, because it's an L-shaped lot, there's a 2-family structure that was built in I think the maybe the 1940s. There are 2 units there. This is what an aerial looks like. So the outline is actually here. And you'll see this is a very symmetrical layout. The portico's here. It really, as you'll see, there's a very strong axis with this intersection. And the site circulation is really, the 2 driveways are at the far ends or edges, the left and right side yards. The L here actually juts into, this portion here is actually in the T5 district itself, and it juts into this T5 neighborhood. So they're about the Manchester Street folks, the Stedman Street residents, and also the Babcock Street residents can actually see this site. What you'll see in some site sections and topos that I'll be showing you is that there's actually a lot of, there's a big steep drop-off beyond the site where this continues into the T5 district. This is a view of the existing structure, which is that 2-unit structure right here. And as you noticed in the planning board letter, if you read it, the preservation planners in their initial review did deem these 2 structures as architecturally or historically significant, but that wasn't determined by the actual commission. Okay, some existing site conditions, because this are the two parcels, and this is a pork chop lot that is behind another parcel here. I wanted just to orient you with what we have. We have two front yards, the front yard obviously on Babcock, and then the front yard that is behind another structure. These obviously are the side yards and the rear yard. Okay, so a little bit about the topography. I know this is hard to read, so I'll just generally describe it. So there is some cross slope as you're going onto the T5 district. Just to orient you, let's say it's street level at Babcock Street. It's about elevation 50 feet. To the center of the site, about 58. And then existing conditions, about 62. The proposed regrading, basically this footprint is going to carve through that rise, and in the back it'll flatten out a little bit more, like 4 feet, but it is very clear that there's about a 10-foot drop off, and we will have topos that actually show that for the next hearing so that you can see what that drop off is. Even though there is a substantial setback here, because it's such a steep drop-off right at property line, you're going to notice when I show you some site sections exactly how those structures, those 2.5-story structures, align with the proposed structure. A little bit more to comment on. There are some structures in the public way, and there's another site plan that is a little more clear where we can see that. There's a street tree here. And there's also a hydrant. So we're a little concerned about where those new curb cuts are going to be. Currently, they're at the far edges of the site, but there is some concern about the turning radii and those structures in the public way. What you see, these little cross-out marks, actually indicate where existing trees, mature trees are. I certainly want to have Tom Brady, who's the town arborist, take a look at those trees. Sometimes there are weed trees on a site, and sometimes there are mature specimens. So we would want to make sure that you're aware of not only where the trees are, but what types of trees they are.
What color is those trees?
They're just, they're crossed out in that lime green, which is not really easy to see.
Okay.
Mhm. Right. So they're mostly concentrated in that front side yard where the loading zone is going to be, clearly in the center of the site, and here as well. Okay. And so this is just another view of this property with that vegetation in the front yard and the street tree over here. Okay, as I mentioned, so where this is situated, if you know Babcock Street, there are a couple of pocket parks. This is the pocket park at Freeman Street. Freeman Street ends up in a Y-shaped configuration, so there's a wider view of the site. There's a very strong access, so it is dead center with the pocket park, and that view shed runs pretty long. I think the planning board letter said, yes, Freeman Street runs to Amory. It's not necessarily that view shed is as extensive, but if you were to stand like about here, you definitely have full view of that site. Now, there is some screening because it is rather lushly landscaped. However, there are deciduous trees. There's certainly the winterscape, there's not as much screening. And keep in mind, we don't have a redesign of this area, so we don't know how much screening will be sustained. Now, one thing I pointed out about that configuration, that very symmetrical configuration of this site, it's not that a proposal that is asymmetrical or modern wouldn't work. It's just because you have this really strong access, whatever is aligned on that front facade and centered is going to get a lot of focal point. It's actually going to help define much more than just the parcels around it, but these deeper view sheds. Again, this is a really wider than typical intersection and a long view shed. Okay, a little bit more about the zoning. So this is interesting. What happens when you have a parcel that spans two zoning districts? If you're familiar with Article 3, it is the zoning district that is more restrictive that would prevail. In this case, it would be the T5. However, there's a special permit provision under Article 3 that states that the lot area for the less restrictive portion can be transferred to the more restrictive portion can be transferred to the less restrictive. And that would be granted, that's a provision that would be granted by special permit by the ZBA. Clearly, we don't have a special permit situation. I just mentioned this to you. Eventually, when you're looking at waivers, you want to look at the deltas for each of the zoning districts. That's just the point I wanted to make. In terms of lot area, it's over 21,000 square feet. 2/3 of that is in the M1.5, and the remaining third is in the T5. Okay, a little bit about the surrounding zoning. So as we're going to show you, we're going to give you this tour, very deliberate tour down Babcock. There are pockets where you have multifamily districts flanking both sides of Babcock Street. Now, if we just step back, we'll see that most of this area is really two-family, and these holes here are really designated by multifamily districts. Now, I mention this because maybe to the uninitiated or at first blush, if you were walking down Babcock Street, starting from the Harvard Street, Coolidge Corner area, which is very commercial, and walking toward Palm Ave and that entire length, you might at first blush say, well, there's not much architectural coherence. There are a lot of different building types here. And that would be a mistake, because while there are different building typologies, there are certain patterns that you can very clearly and definitively discern. And those patterns, like front yard setback or building height or treatment of the open space in those front yards, really helps to integrate the different building typologies so it comes together. Again, this is just another step back to showing you how those puzzle pieces fit together. One thing that we should not overlook, now the subject site is here where that star is. As we're moving toward Calm Ave, you can see we have a local historic district just outside the boundaries of the subject site. Now, what does that say? Well, when you have a local historic district, clearly there are patterns that are recognized, and much more than patterns, there are certain qualities. There's architectural significance or historical significance that really it actually acquires that designation of that area, which spans several blocks. It also contributes and helps us make a case for some of the patterns I'm about to talk about that need to be respected when increasing. Again, we can increase density on the site, but to do so by respecting some of the patterns that we need to acknowledge along Babcock Street. And the local historic district just over that boundary is one of them that's going to help. Ms. Barrett mentioned a housing production plan, and I bring this up. What this page in the plan actually shows are opportunity corridors along our major thoroughfares of Beacon Street and Harvard Street that are opportunities for new affordable housing projects, and then the yellow, which identifies nodes. The subject site is here, which happens to be outside of those areas. Again, not making an argument for, why this project doesn't belong here. That's not the point of the comment that the planning board wants to make. It's just that in this area here, it's more readily defined by lower density projects and two-family structures. Okay, so a little bit more about the existing built environment. I'm going to take you on a tour of Babcock. Starting from here is Harvard Street, and this is the Devotion School. So looking at this particular property on the maps, you'll see that the height is about 40 feet, not much of a front yard setback. Then moving closer down where the Devotion School is, they're 28, 30, and 34 Babcock. Again, the height is around 3.5 stories, 40 feet. Not an excessive height, even though there's like a limited setback for the front yards. Again, this is closer to the commercial area.
How old are those buildings?
Some of them I don't actually have. That's a really good question. I don't have the the years for all of them. I will look it up. The abutting property of 120 Babcock was built in 1920. Okay, this, again, this is another example of some multifamily buildings in the multifamily district. This is a higher density zoning district, the M2.0. And again, there's some regular heights of about 3.5 story, hovering around 40 feet. Okay, and more of the same. This is one of the outliers. This is a very, as you can see, it abuts the Devotion School playground, so there's a lot of open space here. Okay, it is a 9-story building. That height is about 87 feet. And the setback here, I think at the front, I think that's about a, okay, I think she meant that the front yard setback is about 120 feet here. And at 7476 Babcock, we have 3 stories, about 47 feet in height with a limited front yard setback. Okay, a little bit more of this is, again, we're juxtaposing those multifamily with the 2-family districts. So it's not all multifamily on Babcock. Okay, and we're actually looking at, let's see if I can see, if we're entering the local historic district fairly soon. You can see, or not yet, thank you. There are a lot of 2-family, about 2.5-story homes in this 2-family district. Even though the zoning is 2-family, sometimes you might have an anomalous multifamily, and that's really not the case here. There might be some row houses further up on Babcock, but that would actually be in the local historic district. More of the same. Here again, the heights, hover around 50 feet, and this is just another side elevation of this property. Okay, this is where we're looking at here. This is Freeman Street here, and there is another one of our. Actually, this is 110. I actually wanted to get ahead to the condos that are there. This is another anomaly in terms of the front yard setback is mostly parking. That's not something we typically support. It is a deeper setback, even though the height of that building is, again, 4 stories. The rear yard setbacks, it's worth noting that some of this multifamily where it's abutting, now we're not where this open space is, but we're now getting deeper into the 2-family districts. And you can see the rather shallow rear yard setbacks. Okay, this is 120 Babcock. Looking at it from the left, this is the left abutting property to the subject site. Now, it does have a front yard setback of about 19 feet here from the street. I'm just going to go ahead, maybe you could see it on this plan here. It's really like a U-shaped building, really shallow rear yard setback, which is something I'm going to comment on to show you what the shadow impacts would be if we had a taller building next door. But one of the things, this is when I talk about different patterns that help integrate increased density. There is a very deep front yard. There's a courtyard here, which doesn't have the effect of this building looming over Babcock. So there's an opportunity with the 19-foot front yard setback and that deep courtyard space to really have it lend a very residential rather than commercial feel. And it's very much in keeping. So wherever we have 2-family properties, we're going to have those deep front yards that accommodate front yard landscaping. And a lot of these multifamilies do as well. So in combination, the lower heights, the deeper setbacks are ways to integrate the different building typologies, the 2-family homes with the multifamilies. Okay, now this is actually one of our outliers. The subject site is here, and what we're looking at are the condos that are right across the street, diagonally across the street at Freeman and Babcock. There really is not much open space whatsoever and not deep setbacks. It is about 4 stories. I do want to point that out, not to gloss over when we have exceptions, but I really do want to characterize it, or the planning board would like to characterize it as an exception. Now, if we were to continue, actually, while we're here, this is just another point we wanted to make about the relationship between Stedman and Babcock Streets. So this is just an aerial view where you can see one of those outliers, that really tall building. This happens to be abutting that open space, which certainly helps mitigate its height as well as its front yard setback. And then 120, you really can't see it here. We're really blessed to have all of this lush green space, but you can maybe get the idea from this perspective, and there will be others that'll help drive this point home. These properties on Stedman abutting the subject site in 120 Babcock are really about 1 story below. So whatever happens here, you're really going to almost have this sense of it being a 6-story building rather than a 5-story building. Okay, this is just another view of the subject site, an aerial shot. More of the 2-family subjects, you can see how they're treated. Those front yards are treated with landscaping. And here as well, this is just another aerial view showing those condos. Again, this is an exception because it takes up so much. There's really, it's all impervious with maybe there's some verge, but there really isn't any front yard landscaping. It's really maximizes that lot area. And, even though it is, I think, lovely, gracious residence, it's one of the things that we would certainly want to look for opportunities and not have the entire lot area, as is in this exception, to be covered by impervious, whether it's the building footprint or paving. Okay, so the point I wanted to illustrate here are the consistent front yard setbacks. Again, you're walking on Babcock Street, and the setback line is about 20 feet, and you're going to see this maybe with some exceptions, but largely if you move away from the commercial district and start about Dwight Street intersecting with Babcock, on both sides you're going to see 20-foot setbacks no matter what the building type is. And this is just showing that as you're moving along and going toward Comm Ave, here's the subject site, and you can see where these lines are really delineating those consistent 20-foot setbacks, and furthermore up until about Winslow. I think this is Osborne right here. So Winslow is about 1 block away from Comm Ave. Okay, and this is just another aerial view showing that. If you move into the 2-family, the setbacks for those front yards are not as deep, but they are consistent. I think on Stedman they might be around 10 feet. Okay. Just a quick overview of the proposal to get you acquainted again. So this lot area is about, the 2 lots together, a little over 21,000 square feet. And this is delineates the M1.5 from the T5 on that property. The depths of this building is about, I think this is 112, this is 63 feet. This juts into this L area about 50 feet, and this is about, I think, 170 feet. As you can see, this takes up the majority of the site. There really isn't any opportunity for open space amenities, even for the occupants of the site, which is actually something that the planning board was critical of. This area here, which if you recall had a cluster of trees that provided some landscaping, some screening, would actually be taken up by a 60-foot deep loading zone. One thing to note right off the bat is that there really isn't a place to turn around. The existing conditions show driveway and parking area here so that you can circle around and always nose out onto busy Babcock Street. This is a situation where you would be backing out of a loading zone, and that is really verboten. There's no one on staff who supports that, and clearly the planning board was very critical of that. Stormwater, the infiltration system would actually be outside of the building footprint here. Mr. Ditto did review plans and felt comfortable with what is being proposed. Retaining wall is noted here. See, it's like sort of a gray screen. It ranges from 1 to 4 feet. There is no retaining wall at the back, and Mr. Ditto didn't think that one needed to be triggered. What I have here in the blue shows existing curb cuts which would be eliminated and relocated, so they actually pinch closer to the center of the site. So remember I said that we have a really strong axis that is aligned with the portico and the residential entrance of the existing structure. So that portico now is replaced by a garage. Now that garage is set back about 20 feet, which is consistent. It does meet or conforms with our bylaw. But nonetheless, because you have that strong access, anything you put here is going to be emphasized, and certainly a void like a garage lends a more commercial appearance. Planning board did say if it could be actually investigated or assessed rigorously, if that garage entrance could be put off-center or even off to the side. There were some landscape architects on the planning board who wondered if the grade couldn't be lowered by a few more feet. That would certainly lower the height of the building and that ground level. And there was actually one comment. I know the project team has looked into it, but the planning board definitely encourages the ZBA to actually raise the issue of having the garage level depressed subgrade. Okay, a few more things to comment here. You don't see the street tree here, but that new curb cut where the driveway would go, that street tree is there. Again, some concern about the turning radius. If that has to be a wider radius, that might affect that street tree. And there is a hydrant here. If there's any change in the radii of those entrances, they could conflict with the structures in the public way. We do wonder if there needs to be a loading zone on the site whatsoever. This is not a mixed-use project where one would be required on site. This is a residential project. As you noted, if you've read the planning board letter, there is some concern about the parking ratio, and not saying this is the intention, but if this were to be misused as parking, that's something that should not be allowed, certainly not within the first 20 feet. The planning board does not like to see front yard parking within the first 20 feet of the property line. And certainly the loading zone would not be an occasion to have any overflow parking that couldn't be sustained in the garage itself. Okay, this is a little bit more about the setbacks. Looking at the site plan in relation to the Atlas plan, you can see here that, I'll just tell you, these setbacks are about 55 to 60 feet. And while that sounds really generous, you have to look at that in conjunction with the topography. And you'll see some site sections in relation to the topos, where you can see that the drop-off really does put these properties about 1 story below. And for that reason, the planning board felt that the 10-foot setback here was insufficient, that increasing that setback would certainly improve shadow impacts, and think about all of the privacy issues that are really a concern here. Increasing that setback would actually, that height to setback ratio would be improved and would also improve the privacy. And it's not just these, I keep pointing to these maybe 2 abutters here, but you can see how this L juts into, and really because it is at a higher grade, it's almost on a pedestal, and these properties here about 1 story below, they're really exposed on all sides to any impact the proposal has. The abutting property here is very close to the property line. And again, none of this is really open space. It's going to be mostly impervious surface. So there's not much that's going to mitigate or screen that building. Okay, just a little bit more to emphasize. So all of these trees would be eliminated. One thing that we wanted to just point out, even though the stormwater design can be engineered to handle runoff so that it does comply with Article 8.26 of our general bylaw. No one really wants to be cavalier about losing open space, tree canopies. Trees are known for holding on to water on a site to slow the rate of runoff. Those tree canopies, which take a long time to get to develop to the diameter that they do, actually do contribute to mitigating greenhouse gas impacts. So again, it's something to consider in terms of open space amenities for the occupants, screening, again, climate change mitigation, and stormwater runoff.
Maria, I know there's been a comment made about trees behind the property.
Right.
Are they actually on the property at all, or is it irrelevant?
No, so there are,
to the
well, I don't want to
analysis
say
here?
it's irrelevant. So there are, there's some actually very fine, thoughtful landscaping on the abutter's property, below that property line. And one of the things that would be critical would be to ensure that there is a tree protection plan, whether it's for the street tree or any trees on a butter's properties because of the proximity to that developed landscaping.
And for the same reasons in terms of conservation and,
Well, clearly, because it's now normally the town does not get involved in what are civil issues between two private parties, but this is just really driving home that, there are trees that are so close to the property line, and that's not, certainly, there does need to be action taken to take care of. Sometimes abutters will hire their own tree arborist to analyze that area, to suggest a tree protection plan proposal to the applicant. We've seen those things happen. Certainly, this is another compelling argument for increasing the setback of the foundation itself.
thanks.
Okay. So a little bit about the elevations. This is a perspective. Now, this is about from street level. I know there is a sort of a swell here, but if we were measuring from the street, and the final height is actually determined by the building department, and they will weigh in. There are a number of methodologies you can use, but I'm just going to go with what is presented in the plans, with the caveat that all of that will be vetted by the building department. So the height to the parapet, excluding the elevator overrun, is 55 feet 8 inches. As you can see, this is right centered with the site is that garage. It takes about a third of that ground level, but you never know this is really, say, a residential building. It could be an office building, or it could be more suited to like a mixed-use district, in a downtown area, and it might be totally appropriate in those contexts. But for reasons that I will, emphasize, this does not read as residential, and that makes it wholly incongruous with its context, something that would need to be addressed to better, again, integrate this massing and increase density in the area. Other things that contribute to that, I guess, commercial feel, you notice the ceiling to height windows. There's not much differentiation between like what's a living room or a bedroom, so there are a lot of glass. That's another thing that it's also very regimented, and again, doesn't lend a residential, more of a commercial feel. Certainly, the planning board would like to see the residential entrances get priority in terms of hierarchy over the garage entrance, and that's another reason for strongly considering have it, go to the edge or have the entrance be on the side. I know there are design challenges with this site, but I can't emphasize enough that the planning board felt that this does need to be rigorously vetted to see what the possible solutions might be to that problem. The materials themselves, there is some brick and there's also fiber cement siding. The color combinations, like the very strong black frame here, only emphasizes, so where you see at the roof line, the parapet, along the vertical height and the overrun here. Those almost like your eye almost goes to those as a magnet. Really, it basically said this is the building envelope. So there's nothing about that top floor that is helping that massing recede. One of the things that the planning board wanted to make very clear is that setbacks in terms of the front yard, having that increased to 20 feet, in keeping with the modal pattern. For the majority of Babcock was critical. That rear setback should be increased to about 20 feet, which would help mitigate the height of the building. They did not come out and say the top floor needed to be eliminated, but they felt very strongly that the top floor did need to be stepped back further on all sides, especially that rear yard, to enhance privacy. There are some balconies which further, I guess, expand that massing. Some of the juts and jogs that you see really amount to about 1 foot. That front yard setback, if you think about the upper floors, really reduces that front yard setback to about 8 feet. So the juts and jogs really don't carve away that massing. It still reads like a very monolithic cube. Okay, so this is another view. If you are on Babcock Street and you're looking at the other abutter here, so this is ghosted in. This really emphasizes how it's almost like two buildings put together. Now, keep in mind, if we had a 3D model that in its native file, I would have more, I guess, renderings or stills from that model to show you different perspectives. We did get a 3D model, but it is an interactive PDF, and I am pushing for the native SketchUp file, which basically every architect, we've worked with will supply one, and it'll really help you just analyze it from different perspectives. So I hope that is something that we will see moving forward. One thing I'd like to comment on is this is the area of that paved area of the loading zone. Now you'll see that there is an incline as you're moving away from Babcock Street. I measure it to be about 10%, and that would comply with zoning. So within the first 20 feet of a property line, you can't have a slope, whether it's a decline or incline, greater than 10%. Obviously, that has to be verified because it is so close. This is another reason why the planning board is so concerned with that loading zone and the traffic hazard that it presents. You not only would be backing out a vehicle where you have a heavily pedestrian traveled Babcock Street, there are lots of children who are going to the devotion school, but you also have this decline, which really compounds that situation. The visibility, it's just not safe under any circumstances. A little bit more of the elevations. This is the Babcock Street elevation. You'll see that the ventilation for the garage is on all three sides. Now, this is not to say that garages cannot be built at ground level, but we just don't know enough about the ventilation system, and I'm sure the architect will speak to that. But on the limited knowledge that we have, we simply raise it as the planning board raises it as a concern because of the proximity of the two-family neighborhoods. Now, what will happen during the parking and traffic peer review is certainly the structural, the civil engineer who is a structural designer can speak to ventilation systems and how they are meant to comply with zoning, so you can't really build an unsafe one. But the public health issues should be investigated, again, because of the proximity to the two-family neighborhood. Certainly, quality of life issues would be an issue, and that's just another argument for having this be depressed. This is not something that you'd see from different perspectives, either to depress it completely or to lower it a few more feet. And this is the left elevation. So the left elevation is where you have 120 Babcock. This is where the overrun is. There are balconies that seem to be shared with different units, which kind of raised a question mark. There are balconies on each floor on the different facades. And again, that kind of throws out or expands the massing. What would be better if there were open space configured on the site plan itself, which actually offered occupants of the project more amenities and open space rather than these balconies, which actually create some privacy issues with the two-family abutters. The rear elevation, okay, so you can see this seems to be about maybe like a little burnt up here, but if you were actually on the properties below, you would be looking up at this, and you don't really, there really isn't adequate screening on the site in that 10-foot setback, which is a huge concern. Again, this is another reason why increasing that setback to about 20 feet in the rear will help mitigate the height of the building. And also that top floor, if it were stepped back even further, it would allow for a fifth story, but certainly reduce impacts on abutters on really the Manchester and Stedman Street sides. And this is the right elevation, which is directly close to the two-family districts parcels on Manchester and Babcock. Okay, so just a little bit about, so trash. Now, there isn't a trash plan that is submitted. There is an area that is designated. We're not so sure that 62 units receptacles, again, we don't know if there's a trash compactor. If there is, that room might need to be in a separate location on this ground floor for fire safety reasons. The fire department would have to weigh in. I'm not saying there are trash compactors, but that's a consideration. If they're not, that means there are more receptacles. Where are they going to be stored? It is absolutely forbidden to have receptacles for this many units outside of the building footprint, and you won't see much support for that from public health. So that's why we look at some of these issues early on. This is one of the reasons when we talk about density and how do you evaluate density, it's more than just a ratio. You look at attendant uses like parking, like trash storage. These attendant uses can indicate if the site itself can sustain this number of units. Okay, and it is a public health concern as well. The number of parking spaces are 31. The ratio of compact standard is about 29, which is a little higher than our 25% upper limit. The planning board does recommend that the number of compact spaces be brought down to regulation. Currently, they're about 9. Something just in the corner here about FAR, different municipalities calculate it differently. Boston actually has you take out a whole bunch of stuff, and I think this might be the Boston methodology, so there's nothing nefarious here, but we actually include everything. So the FAR ratio might be just a little bit higher than that. It might be over 3, and we certainly will evaluate that with the building commission, but just wanted to point that out. Okay, this is the second floor plan. We do need to see unit layouts. We'd like to see where the kitchens and bedrooms and bathrooms are going to be. I imagine that will evolve, but there was just not enough information according to the planning board. You will see on site plans a 9-foot setback, but the upper floors actually project another 1 foot into that front yard setback. Okay. And just 3rd, 4th, and 5th. The floor plan, the roof plan shows the mechanicals in the center. There will be opportunities to get a little more information about any mechanicals that are put on the roof, cut sheets in terms of what the decibel would be, and the building commissioner can speak more to noise impacts more than I can. And if there were any ventilation from the garage to the roof, that also would need to be examined as well. Okay, the landscape plan, really, it's very rudimentary, but it is in conflict. There is a curb cut that doesn't really show that loading zone, so we would want to see the landscape open space calcs revisited. Okay. So this is just not, and I'm sorry, this is really small type. I just wanted to paint some broad brushstrokes so that you could see what some of the deltas are in terms of what the zoning, required zoning is in 2 districts. And that's why I'm listing the multifamily and the 2-family Again, if this were a 40A case, for instance, there would be a special permit provision that one district prevails over the other. In lieu of that, I'm really just showing you what the baseline's in both of those districts. What we have here is that you might see, when you look at the multifamily, you might see a span of 45 to 50 feet. If you are abutting like a two-family district, and that creates like a 100-foot buffer, the lower building height would prevail. And then looking at building area FAR, obviously the multifamily FAR would be about 1.5, and in the two-family, 1.0. Just moving down to parking ratio, I'll spend a little more time on parking ratio so that you can see the breakdown, but just, again, the broad brushstrokes. There was a amendment to our bylaw. There was a creation of a public transit overlay district, and that warrant article was submitted in September 2016, so it predates the submission of the CBA application, and that is the baseline, not the more restrictive parking minimums that are in place for the rest of Brookline. So with that, you would need about 82 parking spaces for what is being proposed, and that's about a ratio of 1.3. Okay, and there are some provisions regarding open space when you do have a multifamily district abutting a two-family district, and it would be the more restrictive district. Those provisions would apply here. Okay, height is calculated, or the setbacks are actually calculated in this respect. It's really a ratio of how tall the building is. So as you can see, if you're using the multifamily ratios, you're really going to need a front yard setback of about 20, and that's certainly what we see very strongly for the majority of Babcock. The planning board is recommending conformance or compliance with that front yard setback. That's the same for the other front yard rear lot. The left side yard is calculated where you really have what seems to be an unreasonable, almost 40-foot setback. Now, if the garage entrance were to be on one of those sides, that would ostensibly increase the setback. One of the things that the planning board is trying to drive home on the right side, if there can be some way to conserve that open space, that would also conserve that screening and side yard setback area. Okay, and then rear yard setbacks. Again, there's a really rather deep one of 40 feet. And for that reason, the planning board would say, 20 feet, see what that looks like, but that is a reasonable starting place to mitigate some of the impacts here. Just a caveat, all of this does need to be reviewed to make sure that the calculations, the plans are accurate, and of course, the building commissioner is the final arbiter and not the planning department. Okay, I just wanted to repeat that in conjunction with the zoning so that you can see what I'm talking about with the front yard. There are two front yards here because of that pork chop lot. We talked about the shared parking, but just to show you, this is the area that we're talking about here. The property line really cuts through the parking there. The applicant has said he does own other properties in the area which could accommodate the units here. I don't know. There are about, I would say, 35 to 40 parking spaces currently on the site. I don't know how many actually serve. I am assuming it's the majority that serves 120 Babcock, but at least that's the response the applicant has given to the need to displace existing parking. Okay, these were the shadow studies that were submitted, and they do, I'm told, take into account the topography. So the red indicates new shadow impacts through March, June, September, and December. Okay, a little bit more about that design analysis. I just wanted to repeat, this is what we're talking about when we talk about that strong access here and this pocket park here. Having the portico centered squarely on the front facade really drives home that long access here. And that's why anything that is put in the center of the site on the front facade is really going to get more attention than, a typical project would. That's another reason why that gaping void of a, garage entrance is not welcoming and should be reconsidered. Okay, a little bit more about how this, we actually talked about it earlier, so I won't belabor that point. But one thing that I wanted to illustrate a little bit better is that loading zone safety. You can see the existing slope here, the 10% slope here. This is actually a juncture, even though there aren't crosswalks in this area, this is a natural place for pedestrians to cross. The parklet is actually, or the pocket park is actually a destination for dog walkers, and there's enough seating there to really enjoy it as a park. So, right there, this is the existing curb cut, the loading zone moves over. You can really see the conflicts that you'd have, not only with cars that are coming out here, but also pedestrians that are walking along the sidewalk or crossing the street. So these are the turning radii. There are two sets of turning radii that were submitted, and the applicant should speak to them. This was a batch that came in. These are the Hennessy plans, and I isolated the ones that actually designated by the applicant's civil engineer about conflicts. This is actually showing some vehicles, passenger vehicle entering the garage from the north. And so there's a question about how wide that turning radius is. Now, that could actually put it in conflict. If there is a loading zone that remains, it could put it in conflict with the loading zone. So that should be looked at. This is actually another example of how the turning radii here might need to be adjusted, but there is a street tree. Now, as you know, street trees fall under, they're not within the ZBA's purview. This is actually Massachusetts General Law 87, which means that our town arborists would have to have a separate public hearing regarding the health of that tree. And very rarely do street trees ever come down because of a new proposed curb cut. So that is another consideration for relocating the driveway entrance. Okay, another example, if there were to be a truck, if there really is a need for a loading zone, I'm not sure that it is, and that should be discussed with the applicant, but if there were a need for a loading zone and trucks would be going in here, this is just another example of the width of that, that radius, that curb cut, and a potential conflict with the building itself and maybe anyone who's coming out of that door there. Okay, and this is another example of a truck entering the loading zone here. Again, it's the turning radii are at issue. It might actually go over the curb where the hydrant is, and the hydrant is not going to move for a proposed curb cut. We'd also say, too, that we should see some analysis if you're coming from Freeman, if you're entering these new driveways from Freeman, what does that look like? And if you could think back, there's an L-shaped garage. We've asked for turning radii because we have a 90-degree turn there, and that is a two-way drive aisle. We need to analyze what that is with oncoming traffic, how safe that situation is in the garage. Okay, so view sheds, putting up, this is where you're standing at about like Stetson Street. So you can see, I mean, I've tried to get pictures where there's less foliage so you could see how much of the site would actually be exposed. Because of its central location, it's going to have more bearing on the surrounding neighborhood. And if you're standing at Stetson, you would have a clear view of the site. And again, the impending changes there mean we might have less. We really can't depend on screening in the public way. That's another compelling reason to have open space on the site. I mentioned this earlier, as I'm just repeated. Open space is valuable for future occupants of the project. There's got to be a way to conserve open space on the site, and whether it's through increased setbacks or conserving, maybe relocating or eliminating that loading zone, and not being too cavalier about our natural resources and the role that they do have in regard to sustainability and green building. Height, massing, and scale. So this is what I really wanted to show you you can't really get this illustration when you're looking at an aerial, but if you have this is a site section that's going through this portion of the building, and this is a 117 Stedman. So if you look at 117 Stedman, if you can actually see it, it's a little small, but there are dormers on that roof line, and that's about here at the midpoint of that gable, and you can see it aligns with the third story. So despite having a 55 or so foot setback, you can see why the topography really contributes to some really harsh impacts on the rear abutters. Another reason for increasing that setback, maybe doubling it to 20 feet, and also stepping back that upper floor and accommodating a buffering on the site itself. It could certainly serve as open space for the occupants, but definitely much needed buffering and screening for the abutters. Okay, and this is a cross-section here of the site so that you see 120. Now what's really faintly, there is a portion of the building, this is a U-shaped building, and it's kind of delineated with this very faint line here. What you don't see here is the L, so you'd really have to imagine behind this structure there is the L shape portion, or actually here, that you should be also seeing in the elevation. I like to show this. This is another way of describing front yard to height, so front yard setbacks to height ratios. And you can just see for comparison with 120 Babcock, 4-story multifamily with that 19-foot setback, excluding the courtyard, you have a setback to height ratio of about a little over 2. And the existing, I believe, is a little under 2. What's proposed is over 6. So that's just another way of showing you when something is so shallow, it's only going to emphasize that height, and that's another reason why even at 5 stories, just another maybe 10 feet over what would be allowed by zoning can actually have a really overwhelming impact because of those shallow setbacks. Okay, shadow impacts. We saw the shadow studies, but we actually have a real-life example that already exists. So you know where south is here, so anything that's built is going to get in the way of that southern exposure, and that's what we're especially concerned about when we examine shadow impacts on abutters. This is a 4-story building right next door, and you can see, I don't know the time, this is an older aerial shot that I got in April. You can see how the majority of these rear yards are in shadow with the 5-foot setback at maybe about a 45-foot height. So that just gives you an idea, and in comparison, you see the sunshine that these current abutters currently enjoy. So even though shadows cannot be mitigated entirely, it is worth considering how they can best be mitigated. We did talk a bit about architectural style. I won't repeat that unless you have questions. A little bit more analysis about the parking ratio. Okay, so the overall is 0.5, and that is what is supplied by the project team. I just wanted to distribute that by the unit type. So whatever asterisk is only what, I am offering, just trying to figure out how evenly they could be distributed. So studios would probably, with this provision, be getting about 0.4 parking space per unit, the same for the 1-beds. What's required, and this is with the amended zoning for the public transit overlay, this is in comparison what would be required. The planning board felt 1 parking space per studio unit was excessive, but they felt if, around what is being offered was probably too little, or if any, some parking space should be offered for the studios. And one comment, there are 8 3-bedrooms, 1 parking space might not be sufficient. So a more practical parking ratio, certainly higher than 0.5, should be investigated. And some of the recommendations, if they were followed, could bring that parking ratio in line. And this is just another example of assessing density through intensity of use. This is one of the factors to measure or evaluate intensity of use. Okay, rubbish management, I will repeat that this is another factor for assessing intensity of use and determining what is a reasonable density for this site. Some of the questions that the applicant will need to address in a rubbish and recycling plan to be reviewed by Environmental Health and the Fire Department. Is this going to be managed by a private service? How many times per week is pickup planned for both trash and recycling? Those are usually on separate days. What are the sizes of the respective receptacles? How many? Where are they going to be located? Will there be a trash compactor? How noisy will it be? Is it going to be located in a place that doesn't create a fire safety hazard? Is the storage room adequate enough to accommodate receptacles within the building footprint? Cannot stress that enough. No one is advising receptacle storage outside of the building footprint. And if public health, this is usually a condition in our decisions, but if public health were to examine the adequacy of this plan 1 year after 90% occupancy, when you actually can see how the site is being used, would there be enough room in that trash storage room to accommodate scaling up of that plan, that is, having more receptacles on site? As you know, there will be technical reviews, a traffic study, a parking demand analysis, analysis of how that parking is designed, as well as the safety, the access points, and any conflicts with traffic and pedestrians. There will be a site and building design peer review. Stormwater must comply with our general bylaw, Article 8.26, which Mr. Ditto will be, because he will also speak to traffic. I'm sure that he will attend the session where peer review is here, and you can speak more about stormwater management with him. We are asking for a rubbish management plan very early on, also evaluating light and noise management. We have several bylaws where any lights from headlights or sites cannot spill over onto abutting properties, and police and fire will continually review plans as they evolve for any new safety issues. I do want to stress the need for the SketchUp model in the native file and not an interactive PDF. I don't think that applies about the shadow studies. Site sections, list a site section through that loading zone to better analyze that slope to make sure it's not greater than 10%. Driveway access analysis from Freeman Street, and there probably will be additional requests as we proceed. So to sum up, some recommendations: absolutely no backing out of the loading zone onto Babcock, evaluate the turning radii and the driveway location, increase front and rear setbacks to about 20 feet, conserve existing mature trees in the front yard if possible, create usable open space, increase that setback at the right side rear L, which is very intrusive into the two-family area, step back that top floor to further mitigate the massing and increase the articulation where possible, so it isn't not a monolithic structure. Increase the importance of the residential entrance over the garage entrance. Evaluate the possibility of having subgrade parking. This was a huge issue. The architectural style has to be much more sympathetic to the surrounding context. Certainly use warmer materials, and some of the patterns I talked about will help integrate the site plan overall with the surrounding context. Improve the regimented fenestration, prepare a tree protection plan, not just for, say, existing trees on the site, but on abutters' properties and the street tree in the public way. Achieve a more practical parking ratio, and assess trash storage for adequacy. So I think that covers everything that was in the planning board's letter. Any questions that I might be able to answer on their behalf?
Questions?
Oh, very, very thorough.
No.
No. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you, Maria, do you also want to go through other communications? And just for the record,
Certainly.
we've received a variety of letters from different town departments. And you can touch on, I don't need you to read the letters.
No,
but you
I'll
can
just,
touch on
in general,
topics
yeah,
of
so
what we've
police,
received.
they were concerned, the police department was concerned about that loading zone. We know this is a residential use, but said, if the use were to ever change to commercial, for whatever reason, they'd be doubly concerned about that loading zone use. The fire department at this time did not see, they felt confident that they can access the building the way they need to. So that was in compliance. But they do want to see plans as they involve. That is very important. So that's police and fire. The DPW.
Let me stop
Yep,
you. And fire did not see any other safety concerns.
They did not, no. No. Again, there are some issues with trash storage. If they are introducing a trash compactor, clearly that has to be run by the fire department. And the garage, the ventilation, we just don't have enough information about the ventilation system, but just have to really flag it as something that has to be, we just have to rule out any public health issues to see how much of it can be mitigated. So that is just something that we flag as an important issue to revisit. And Mr. Ditto did not have an issue with stormwater. There was some back and forth regarding issues that he has raised, and the civil engineering team was responsive. So he is satisfied with the stormwater management plan. Again, as the plans evolve, we have to circle back to these departments. This is not, just one opportunity for departments to comment on the proposal.
Great. Questions? No? Thank you. Ms. Allison. Tell us who you are.
Allison Steinfeld, Planning Director. If I could just follow up on something Maria said about ventilation. I just received an email from our parking sub, who is an expert in parking facilities, but he is not an expert in air quality. If you are concerned about that issue, I would hope that you would now ask the applicant if they would agree to pay for a sub on air quality. I'm preparing the contracts now, and I'd like to know now if that's important to you.
Jeff, up there, yes. Tell us who you are.
For the record, Jeff Engler from SEB, Affordable Housing Developer and Consultant, representing the applicant. Just on that issue, at this time, we are not prepared to pay for that consultant. Quite frankly, I'm surprised we're hearing of it. To the best of my knowledge, every other 40B that's been proposed has a similar garage to what's being proposed here, not to mention countless other developments in Brookline with podium parking and mechanical ventilation, and not once have we had an air quality expert look at that issue. So frankly, I'm surprised and would ask the board, what's different about this application than all the other 40Bs before it? Because a lot of what Maria presented tonight is not a surprise and things that we certainly have to look at. But air quality, come on, it's like saying the carbon emissions from the removing of trees. I used to drive through South Brookline every day, and there are single-family houses that remove 10 times the number of trees that we're removing on this site. So a lot of what was presented is certainly legitimate, and we have our work cut out for us, and we have to roll up our sleeves. But at this time, we're not prepared to pay for a ventilation expert on a garage design that has been proposed countless times and all other 40Bs before it.
Well, I don't want to put words in Maria's mouth, but I suspect that her answer is going to sound something like you're 10 feet away from these folks' houses.
Right, so that is actually just one of the concerns. I do want to acknowledge, sure, 40 Center does have ground level parking. some of the issues, again, it's something that's come up because of the proximity. You can see some of these homes are right on the property line with the ventilation openings in direct line, even if there is a fence. One of the things I didn't mean to ask for it so soon, I figured it would come up as a result of parking peer review. So Mr. Stadig is a structural engineer, and he is a principal at Walker Consulting and knows probably more than the typical designer about safety and exhaust. And he may very well not see an issue, but he just wants to bill himself as not a public health expert. And if you wish to dive a little deeper into the issue of air quality and public health, he just wouldn't be the person to dive deep. He could certainly speak to how the ventilation meets zoning code, et cetera.
Can I make one question, or
Sure.
make one comment? I think it's possible that the number of parking spaces will increase, so that there may be a different product or that's being looked at. And as Mr. Engler knows, just because we didn't object in the past or seek information about this in the past has no bearing on whether we should look at it now. And in fact, I'm like, oh, gosh, maybe I should be looking at that in 455 Harvard. So be careful of what you say in relation to that. So in terms of planning ahead, I think it's a perfectly valid thing to put on the list.
Sure, of course.
I have one other point to make on this issue.
I think Mr. Harvey has something.
Mr. Huzzy?
Mr. Hussey. Yeah, that's an attorney.
I've got a question, actually. My recollection of the building code is that if you've got a certain amount of open area in the walls, you do not have to mechanically ventilate the garage. And is that going to be the case here? Is it going to have enough openings so it naturally ventilates, or is it going to require mechanical ventilation? So I think that
Peter Barchett with Cube3 Studio. As it's currently designed, the garage is intended to be naturally ventilated. If we're changing the position of the slab or changing the way it relates to the grade, that may change in the future.
okay. Does that answer your concern?
I would also ask a rudimentary, well, okay.
Yeah, I think with what the board has to do is it has to reserve its rights here. In particular because I think the board is going to engage in some serious conversation about whether this form of parking, the number of spaces, the method that they're delivering the number of spaces is all adequate. They've proposed at-grade or sort of at-grade parking. Maybe that is not what the board sees as appropriate, given concerns over safety at this location. So I think the discussion about whether there is value in having this additional review depends on what our ask is with respect to the parking.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps then I could offer an compromise that I'd be authorized to include it in the contract, but we will not invoke that section of the scope unless directed by the ZBA. Just so I don't have to come back and amend anything.
I'm fine with it, but
If the applicant agrees to.
that's the part I was going to caution you about. Mr. Engler has made it clear that the applicant is not going to pay for it. So unless that changes, you can include it in the proposal, but he ain't going to pay for it.
Yet.
Maybe
Yeah.
he's changed.
Maybe
his mind.
I'll separate
Maybe
it
we'll-
out. I'll
maybe
separate
we'll
it out
convince
and
him
ask for a
otherwise.
cost.
Okay?
I think, one thing to just, we're going to have peer review in about a month. And certainly, those questions, you'll have more opportunity to ask questions of Mr. Static, who is really an expert in, parking design, and what he can't answer might actually guide you as to what further technical expertise you need. So perhaps the question is just premature at this point. Usually these processes work out so the project ends up being better for all parties involved, and it's just a matter of pacing. the need for technical review.
Right, right. Okay. Great, thank you. Maria, anything else on town boards and departments? That's it? That's it. Great, okay. I now want to invite the public to provide its testimony, just by a show of hands. How many people here are offering testimony? Okay, so a fair number. Again, I want to keep this kind of efficient. We're at 9:10 now, but we do want to get everybody in. We have received a fair number of letters, so that I want people to be aware that we did receive your correspondence, and I've reviewed them. I'm sure the other board members have reviewed them. I'm fine if you want to refer to your correspondence. What I think would not help the process is if you simply read your correspondence. It is already entered into the record for this hearing. Obviously, as I said before, listen to what other people have to say. If you agree with them, by all means, tell us that. If you have additional information, absolutely tell us that. Be polite so we can hear everybody and move along in a reasonable fashion. I see Dan Hill. Do you want to kick it off?
Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Not to interfere, but I'd like to make it clear that if anybody who's speaking has submitted a letter, please let us know that you have submitted a letter, so that we can link the two.
You want to know by their name?
Well, if anybody comes to speak, and they do, and they have submitted a letter, I would like to know that.
Okay.
Question is, are letters that were sent to the selectmen included in your record?
Maria, do you know if those would have made their way to us?
Everything is on the website, so.
But we wouldn't have trolled the website for those letters. We would have reviewed letters.
Your
that were
record would be
submitted
what's
to us.
submitted to you,
Yeah, that's.
which may be by referral from the selectman's office. I mean, if the selectman received
I
letters.
don't believe that's the
They
case.
are,
Yeah, okay.
Because there are letters that refer to one submitted to the selectmen.
I see.
Which I know I did not see.
I see.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So I think the answer is no. If you submitted a letter just to the selectmen, unless it was deliberately forwarded to us in copy format, we have not received it.
So if you can write it to the selectmen, you should also write to me.
You absolutely should.
Because this is the board that's going to make the decision.
Mr. Hill submitted a letter. Yes.
Go ahead, Mr. Hill.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Dan Hill. I'm the land use attorney, represent the direct abutters on Stedman Street. First off, I want to say one thing. I agree with Maria. In all seriousness, we sincerely appreciate the thoroughness of the planning department's review of this project, and we do agree with most of the comments that were made, and subject to a few exceptions, which I'll get into this evening. I want to make 3 points tonight. The first point is that this project is an excessive overutilization of the site. The planning department has it right. The issue here is intensity of use. The issue is not the number of units. The issue is the intensity of use of the site. The selectmen summarized it well. The design, massing, bulk, height, scale, absence of open space, and reasonable setbacks are in stark contrast to the neighborhood context. More importantly, the high concentration of units and intensity of use of this parcel raise a number of planning and public safety concerns. The second point is that these concerns about the proposed intensity of use, 62 units on a half acre, is shared by your public departments. It's shared by your planning department and planning board. It's shared by your police department, and it's shared by your preservation committee, and most likely to be other boards that are coming down the line. The third point is that the waivers needed to accomplish this overutilization of the project site are not necessary for the economic viability of this project. Again, I'll break that down. The 62-unit project needs substantial waivers from the zoning bylaw to make this work. Substantial waivers from the dimensional requirements. The primary job of this board under 4D is to make decisions on waivers. Waivers that are necessary for the viability of a project generally have to be allowed. unless there's an overriding, severe, unmitigatable public health, safety, environmental planning concern. I agree with Judy's summary of that standard. Waivers that are not necessary for the economic viability of a project need not be waived. And so that really encapsulates the balancing test under 40B. If it's necessary for the economic viability, then it's your job to decide, is there an overriding public health, safety, environmental concern that justifies a denial of that waiver? If not, then you generally have to allow the waiver. The law requires the zoning board to hold a hearing to collect evidence on what the impacts these waivers will have on the safety and health and environment. If the ZBA wants to scale back the waivers, it can propose that. It can propose waiver decisions and conditions to the developer, and then the developer has the burden to prove that those waiver denials or conditions make the project uneconomic. And there is a process in the regulations for that, and Judy mentioned that. And I also appreciate the comment by Ms. Poverman about there is law that says that a town that's closer to the 10% gets more credit for the local concern side of the ledger on that balancing test. The case happens to be Lunenburg, and a case that I represent the town on. And so there is precedent, and it actually comes from the regulation. There's actual language in the reg, which I cited in my letter, that states that. So when you're proposing conditions or thinking about denying waivers or perhaps scaling back a waiver, and I'll give a perfect example of this, right? They're asking for a waiver from the rear yard setback. So your bylaw requires 37.6 feet or 40 feet, as Maria said. They're asking for 10 feet. You don't have to say 10 or 40, you can say 30, right? And so that's something you could propose. We actually think 30 would be more reasonable than 20, but that's something you could propose to the applicant as part of this process and say, well, we think it should be 30. Show us why you can't make that work economically. Those are the 3 points. So I want to just first start by mentioning a jurisdictional issue. Judy mentioned site control as one of the jurisdictional issues. I mentioned this in the letter. I'll just briefly touch on it. We think there's 2 problems with the site control of this property. Number one, 138 Babcock Street is held by Richard Slater. Record title is held by Richard Slater. There's an unrecorded deed. We don't have evidence that deed's been recorded, conveying title to either Rettles LLC or to the Babcock Place LLC. And then second, the P&S agreement that was provided to the board to show site control, I believe, is expired. And I'm not aware of an extension. Perhaps there is extension, and that's something you should ask the applicant to provide. Oh, sorry. I've got so much to say in such a little time. So we'd ask the board to look at those 2 site control issues. And if there's not a satisfactory resolution of those issues, there is a process in the regulations to report that to Mass Housing and ask Mass Housing to take a look at that. Moving to the substantive issues, I first want to address the parking and loading issue. And I'm trying not to repeat anything that Maria said. We agree with the concern overall that the planning department and board has about the adequacy of the parking. The main point I want to drive home tonight is this. If there wasn't the TPOD bylaw, this project would require 126.4 parking spaces. That's 2 parking spaces per unit. That's the old bylaw. The TPOD took in consideration the fact that a lot of property is within walking distance to the green line. This property is in the TPOD. So under the TPOD, the required parking drops from 126 to 82. Now the applicant would say, well, the reason we don't need as much parking is because we're within walking distance to the T. Well, in our view, that's what the TPODs did. So you've already got a consideration of walking distance to the T as part of your analysis for parking. For that reason, we think that the TPOD requirement of 82 spaces is the appropriate baseline for this project. It's already reducing the off-street parking requirement in Brookline. Reducing it further doesn't make any sense. So we actually think that 82 spaces is a defensible parking position for this project and for the zoning board to impose as a condition. Obviously, they can't provide 82 spaces on the site, and that would drive the intensity of the use. It has to be a smaller project. to meet the TPOD parking requirements. What they're providing here is 31, which is 38% of the minimum requirement. This project, by the way, provides fewer parking spaces, a smaller ratio of parking spaces than this board approved for 40 Center Street. So at the very least, I think this board should follow its own precedent and at least stick to the minimum required for 40 Center Street. But again, we feel that by adopting the TPOD, the town of Brookline went through analysis as to what an appropriate parking demand is for this kind of property, and frankly, the zoning board should follow that and not change it. We are concerned about the ventilation. It shouldn't matter if it's mechanical or natural. These vents are backing up to 7th Street. By the way, the trash room is also in the rear of the parking garage, so that'll be ventilated towards my clients. I can imagine how fun that'll be. These are issues that should be evaluated by the board during this public hearing. Density, intensity of use. We've already discussed how the project exceeds what would be allowed under current zoning. I presented in my letter an exhibit, a colored exhibit, Exhibit B, which shows what a more reasonable project application could look like on this site. The planning department and the board have commented that the site could accommodate a greater density. If your setback in the rear was 30 feet, if you had 20-foot front yard setbacks, more generous setback on the side with that abutter on Babcock, who I don't represent, but certainly is probably one of the most affected abutters. This project could accommodate maybe 27 units. And frankly, I think that the applicant should probably look at scaling this down to a more reasonable size. Traffic and pedestrian safety. Those issues have been adequately addressed, in our opinion, so far by the police department, the planning board, and we would just support their request for additional information that they've asked for. I think some of my clients may speak on those issues as well. Stormwater management. The application includes what we view as a simplified narrative prepared by a civil engineer. There are a number of discrepancies in the plans. The site plan shows a rectangle-shaped box labeled stormwater management system that's approximately 10 by 20 feet under the loading area. A different plan that's included with the stormwater report shows a much larger infiltration system. And as has been noted already, the loading area doesn't even exist on the landscaping plan, so there's a complete conflict between the landscaping plan of this project and the stormwater plan and the loading plan. With respect to fire protection, we remain confused why the fire department doesn't see the problem here. There are no fire lanes around this building. You have 10-foot setbacks on the side and rear. These setbacks will be consumed by what appears to be vegetation. So there'll be no access to the side or rear of the building. Now, the response, I assume, would be, well, the building's going to be sprinkled, and that should be enough. We've seen a lot of tragic fires lately, including one in Waltham this past week, and I think this is an issue that the board should look at carefully, and maybe we need to look at the law a little bit more closely to see what exactly is required. We have a different view of what's required than apparently the applicant and the fire chief. Trash management, we echo the concern that was raised about the size of the trash room. We can't help but turn back and look at the 40 Center Street project because that building is very similar to what's proposed here. The site's quite similar, actually, as well. That was 10,000 square feet. This was 20,000, but it utilized basically the entire perimeter of the site as this does. And in that decision, this board required at least 4 containers, 2 for trash, 2 for recycling, and enough space for 2 additional containers. And that project had a compactor. There's no way 6 containers are going to fit in this trash room on these plans, even if that's the correct volume for 62 units, let alone 40. So we would respectfully request that the board ask the applicant to provide to you a quantitative trash generation and storage analysis by somebody who's competent to provide that, and for that to be peer reviewed by the planning department. With respect to noise, we raised this issue in my letter. These are where this project is proposing air conditioning compressors on the roof. You've got residential uses surrounding this project. You've got the 7th Street folks who are probably between 10 and 14 feet lower than the elevation of the site. So we have a real concern that these air conditioning compressors will be heard at a level greater than 10 decibels above ambient once they're installed. So we would like to see some analysis on that, and that's fairly common with large projects such as this, at least that I've been involved with, for the applicant to provide at least the specs for these machines. Every manufacturer of these kind of compressors has spec sheets that say what the decibel output is for their units, and so it's not that difficult to sort of make some educated guesses as to what the output would be then 10 feet away. And by the way, the state law limits increases of noise at the property line of greater than 10 decibels above the ambient level. The shadows, picture's worth 1,000 words. You saw the shadow maps in the presentation. This project will cast morning shadows over the 7th Street neighborhood backyards, maybe 3/4 of the year. And so we're going to lose natural sunlight during that time. That's an unfortunate and, in our view, an intolerable consequence of a project like this that could be mitigated. Perhaps a greater setback, perhaps 3 stories instead of 5. I mean, these would make big differences for shadows. Trees are another concern of ours, the trees on our properties. We're concerned that the elevation differences have not been adequately characterized by the applicant. We thought they were going to be by this hearing. I don't think they have yet. And we're concerned that this project, 5-story project being built 10 feet from the property line, will have a destabilizing effect on our properties. Whether or not that requires a retaining wall, engineering advice would be helpful on that, but we still have concerns about the building and the excavation affecting the roots of our trees over the line. Finally, applying the legal standards to this application. As I mentioned, the project is only entitled to waivers to the extent they're necessary to make the project economic. And given the substantial impacts this project is going to have on the public health, the safety, and the environment, we would respectfully urge the board to follow the regulatory process that Judy mentioned and ask the applicant to provide the pro forma once you have make some decisions as to what level of waivers is appropriate for this project. We think that's an appropriate exercise to do in this case. Different from 40 Center, it might be different from other projects you've worked on, given the true intensity of the use of this project. And along those lines, a brief comment on the pro forma. I've looked at the pro forma that was submitted to Mass Housing. What's interesting is that the site preparation and soft costs here are more than 200% of the same expenses that the developer carried on 40 Center Street. You kind of have to ask yourself, what's that much different between those two projects that are being built at roughly the same period of time, using the same architect, the same consultants, and a very, very similar design of the building. I would note that the 40 Center Street project acquisition cost is almost the same as the land acquisition cost for this project. So you kind of ask yourself, well, how can 62 units be necessary here if 40 units was adequate at 40 Center Street? And so that, I think, illustrates the need and importance of having the financials truly vetted by somebody with some experience, and there's plenty of folks that Judy can recommend who have done this for zoning boards, looking at the numbers and advising the board, are your decisions going to make this project uneconomic? Because that's something that you all should understand before you close the hearing and make some decisions. So we'd ask that process be followed as well. That wraps it up. I appreciate the time. We'll continue to provide input during this process, and again, thank you for the department for providing a very thorough review.
Thank you. I have a question, but it's somewhere between you and Judy. So, Mr. Hill has suggested that we should force the hand of the developer to see the pro forma. And my understanding is that it is not quite that simple. We can't simply turn to the developer and say, well, show us your numbers.
You need to ask them to make changes to the project that they then, this is my interpretation of the regulations, that the applicant either can make or will say, I can't do that, that will make my project uneconomic. And at that point, that's when the board
Right.
says, then provide a pro forma demonstrating that, and we'll have it reviewed by an independent consultant.
So the board has to have a legitimate request in some fashion and place a condition on the project that then drives a response from the applicant, is what the process is, right? I think that's slightly different than what you were describing.
No,
I'm not sure it's all that different.
No, I think that's how I meant to describe it.
Okay.
But I would say that you can look at the pro forma now because it's been submitted to the state. So there is a pro forma out there. It has the land costs, it has the site costs, it has the projected income. And so you can draw some conclusions like I have about some of the basic financials. And I think that should inform your thinking as this hearing progresses, that there perhaps is some room that the developer has here to reduce the size of this project.
Thank you.
I have a question. So this gets to jurisdictional, rather the site control question. In terms of looking at whether or not the applicant has site control, I was looking at the statute that you cited in your letter, and as I read it, it said that we can go back to mass housing for a determination as to whether or not the applicant has site control, only if there's been a significant change in the project, rather than, as I understand it, otherwise having to accept it as a given that there's control over the site once the PEL has been issued. I'm asking you, Judy.
I'm sorry, it was an emergency. No, it was an emergency. I had to answer that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I have a sick husband.
sorry.
I don't-
Excuse me, but shouldn't we let the developer present his site control response before we start questioning whether it's
No, I
valid
think
or
what I'm
not?
saying is I don't think it's in our jurisdiction. I think we can't.
No, I think it is within our jurisdiction to ask about it, but they have a response probably.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you have a question about site control, you should ask the applicant, and the applicant's burden is then to show that they have it. But I think the practice here has been that you ask the subsidizing agency to review, because they already did a review, and ask them to weigh in on it. I mean, I think that's what you've done. In at least one other case I'm familiar with here, where there was a question about site controls, you bumped it back to the subsidizing agency. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're correct.
Okay.
I wasn't part of that.
Okay.
Do you want to ask Mr. Allen?
Oh, well, I think the question is now out there, Mr. Allen. Do we want to explain to the board what site control you do have?
No, I'm sorry, I don't need to go, I just see.
We feel like it's not your jurisdiction, and we had proved site control already, and we still have site control.
Well, the question's been put forward that you have an unrecorded deed, you have an expired purchase and sale agreement. Can't you respond to that?
That's not correct. We have site control. I don't know where he got his information from. He did his research. I can tell you, I can stand here.
I'm not
I can tell
asking
we
you to
have site
show it,
control.
I'm just asking you. You have a
We have
valid-
site control.
You have a valid purchase and sale agreement, and you have valid...
We have more than that. We have complete site control.
Is it included in the documents that you have submitted with your comprehensive permit, as is required by the statute?
Right.
That I'm not positive about.
Then can you submit those documents, please? It is
Well,
required.
you have to demonstrate that you have site control.
With the comprehensive permit. No, it's something you have
It's
to
in the
submit.
statute.
With your comprehensive permit, please submit that documentation. I think that's what we're asking.
We will make
for.
sure that all the paperwork is correct, but I can tell you that we do have site control.
Thank you.
statute doesn't even use the word subsidizing agency, nor does it use the word project eligibility letter.
Okay, let's work our way back, so if people want to move forward, people who want to speak. Is there anybody in the row behind Mr. Hill? Don't jump up. Next row. No.
Hi, my name is Greta Fox. I live at 125 Stedman Street. That is that odd-looking carriage house on the corner of Manchester. It's attached to 16 Manchester. Our building is in the historical zone. It was built circa 1898. We're very concerned about air quality, among other things. I just want to briefly echo what you said, ma'am. I'm not good with names, but just because we have not looked at air quality in the past is not a reason to say, wait a minute, that was wrong. I worked in the public sector for a lot of my career as a health professional. You can make a diagnosis of 25% certainty of asthma if you live in a zip code 02125. So you can't say, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, 02125, which is Dorchester. But the point is that just because we have not been looking at air quality before does not mean that that was dumb and that we shouldn't look at it. Just basic common sense that we should look at it going forward. I have a couple of other public health concerns. I did submit a letter, but just to summarize very briefly, and I will talk more slowly, sorry. During both demolition and construction, okay, we, the very close abutters, have concerns. Small particulate matter, contaminated with known toxins and carcinogens. How are you going to protect us from that? What are the building materials inside? This is a legitimate question. Inside the structures that are being torn down, how do we know that there's no lead or asbestos in there? How are you going to protect us from the debris? How are you going to protect the air, groundwater, and the soil in our backyards where we grow vegetation, where children and pets play? The other thing that I just wanted to bring up was just on a personal note. So we do live in a historical building that can't be modified. It is a drafty building. Okay, so it's cold. We'll put on a sweater. That's on us. Everybody who lives in that building is asthmatic. Okay, one of the residents has a condition that predisposes them to cancer, which is environmental toxins and carcinogens are a trigger. And we literally have nowhere to go when all that stuff blows right through our house. And we would like to know how the builder plans to protect us as well as our fellow abutters from these public health hazards, not risks, but actual hazards. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Guy Staff, and I live at 123 Stedman Street, which is one of the properties that directly abuts the site. I believe it's been referred to as the rear yard. In a Board of Selectmen hearing on this very project, Chairman Wyszynski described 40B as a blunt instrument. Since I learned about this project last November, I've experienced blunt force trauma from it. Many people, including some in this room, might think, stop being emotional. But we're talking about the notion of home, which is an emotional and personal topic. When this board, the planning department, and the project team have moved on to other business, my family, my neighbors, and I will be living with the outcome of this process, of this project, every day. I start and end my day looking out my bedroom window onto our backyard and plot of this proposed project. In the summer, the deciduous trees filter out the hot sun. You saw some great differences between winter and spring and summer in these pictures that were shown earlier. In the winter, they let welcome warmth through. In these summer nights, I got to admit, not tonight, my family eats in the relative privacy of our backyard. We spend time in a hammock near the property line that many of you may have seen during the site visit. We don't have a picture-perfect lawn or a large estate, but with our neighbors, we have built our yard into a place we love. We're grateful for the friendships we've cultivated and what we've enjoyed for the 17 years we've lived in our house. Many words have been written and spoken, some by me, some by many in this room, about the technical components of this project. It is too large, too dense, too close to neighboring buildings. It presents many technical issues and does not visually fit into its context. I'm going to ditto much of what Ms. Morelli and Mr. Hill said, and appeal to this board to act on behalf of those most impacted by this project, its immediate neighbors. Ms. Barrett has and will detail requirements of state law and limits on the action of this board relative to other types of proposals that come before it. Yet, within those limits, the board can still act on behalf of the neighbors and other town residents. Several of us have had pleasant but not yet fruitful discussions with Mr. Slater. I am downcast, but still have hope that an agreeable path forward can be found. As Ms. Morelli and Ms. Barrett correctly observed, the clock is running. A new building doesn't have to be 10. We're talking about going from 6 to 62. That's 10, at least according to the math that I know, 10 times the number of units what is on site today. It doesn't have to kill every single tree on its property and damage those that abut it. It need not tower over neighbors with unbroken walls, windows, security lights, noise, and car exhaust fumes. This board has an important and difficult job to do, and I thank you for tackling it. And I ask that you make sure the outcome does not destroy the quality of life for the neighbors of this project that are going to need to live with it long after this conversation is forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carrie Staff. I'm Guy's wife. I live as well at 123 Stedman Street, rear abutter to this project. I have written letters with my husband as well as some signed with my neighbors as well, which have already enumerated all of our concerns about the project. And I thank Ms. Morelli and the planning staff and the planning board for their recommendations, which for the most part I endorse and would encourage you to uphold their recommendations. I wanted to just speak briefly about some discrepancies in the materials that have been submitted. In particular, there's a question about the rear property line and the location of the buildings with 120 Babcock Street and the proposed building. Ms. Morelli has stated that there is a 5-foot setback from 120 Babcock Street to its property line, but then the project has proposed a 10-foot setback, and yet on the plans, the two buildings, the new one and 120, are in line with each other, and the property line is in line with each other, with the two property lines. So I don't know how one set of space can be 5 feet and the other can be 10. On the Atlas plan that Maria referenced and is included in her presentation, it does show 120 being closer to that property line, but yet those documents show some other seeming inaccuracies about our properties that we know that don't sit on a property line, for instance. So I'm not sure where the most accurate information is, but if that could be clarified so that, in addition, the stakeout plan, also the stakes that are on the property also show two building corners in line with each other as far as they are away from the property line. So that's one inconsistency. Another one is the site section, which Dan Hill mentioned also, in particular the one that shows 117 Stedman Street and the hill going down to that. The original site sections were showed no elevation change, and these new ones are improved, but there's no data on that plan, that site section, to show us what the actual drop from the site property to our backyards is. So I believe Maria said that she would have additional topographic material at the next hearing, but we'd like to know what data was used to create those site sections so that we know that they're accurate. And the reason that we are concerned about that is Maria's pointed out that the dormer of 117 aligns horizontally with the third floor of the building, the proposed building. So if indeed the hill is longer and our backyards and homes are lower, the dormer may actually align with the second floor. So we'd just like to know what that data was used and ensure that the document was accurate, the site section is accurate. In addition, the tree survey that has been done, I understand that there are generally accepted principles of what size trees are included on a tree plan, but I just wanted you all to know that not all of the trees that are on our property or the site property are accurately reflected on the plan, and even though some of them may not be large enough to be on a site, on a tree survey, they nonetheless are quite leafy and provide a lot of screening. So I don't want you to look at that plan and say, oh, well, there's only 8 trees that are coming out, when in actuality there may be many others that provide useful screening and valuable shade to us. All of the surveyor's plans, actually any of the documents that are labeled by the, Hennessy or DGT, all of them have a label in the center of the proposed building, a little square rectangle that says 4-story building. And I just want to make sure that everyone who looks at those incidentally and may forget from time to time that this is actually a 5-story building. So I don't know if that can be corrected or not. And finally, just a brief thing that I noted is that the project team's traffic consultant recommended that the driveway in the building, the interior driveway, be no narrower than 24 feet wide. But yet, I believe the plan describes a 23-foot wide driveway. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention as well. And that concludes my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Working back, who's next? Ma'am?
I'm Jody Manasevit, and I'm a Jody Manasevit, JODIEMANASEVIT. I'm a Stedman Street abutter at 119 Stedman Street, and I have written a number of letters, one of which fairly recently, which was addressed to the ZBA. So you can reference that letter. First of all, I'm a neighbor with Guy and Carrie, and I agree with everything they said, and I agree with everything that Dan said, and I agree with 98% of what Maria said. And I would like to thank Maria for making such an impressive case against this project, which is too big. And the problems that other people have spoken about, I'm not really going to go into because other people have done it much more eloquently than I have with all of the traffic and pollution and everything. So I can only speak about this tonight from a very personal point of view, from how I'm going to experience this project. This proposal, this is heartbreaking. And the reason why is because it means that when I sit outside in my backyard, which is a full story lower than this project, I'll be looking at and be confronted by a 5-story unbroken wall of windows, barely 10 feet from the property line, without the beautiful canopy and screen of the mature 50-foot trees that we will lose to construction. It means the loss of easily a half a day of direct light and a lot of just ambient light, which nourishes our garden, and the loss of privacy, which we will experience, will deeply impact our comfort in our own space. I hope that the ZBA looked at the picture that I attached to my letter, because we took a picture of balloons that were elevated to a 50-foot height, which is slightly less than the proposed height of this building, that shows the height of the building as we will experience it from our ground level, which actually will be, as has been mentioned, as a 6-story building. I'd also like to point out that that many of the trees in that photograph are actually probably around 60 feet tall, and many of those trees will be obliterated by this project. We bought our side of the 2-family house that we live in 25 years ago, and I chose it after looking at many, many potential places to buy because it had a backyard, which was not easy to find at that time because so much of the open space of Brookline has been converted to parking spaces. So people don't really have yards in a lot of neighborhoods. A year after we bought our house, our neighbors bought the other side of our house. And together, we recognized the potential that this yard had for us. It was at the time ugly and full of trash and rubble, but it was clearly something that had a lot of potential. So together, through thousands of hours of work over 25 years and thousands of dollars, we made something beautiful, and we developed a deep friendship. And together and separately, we cherish the outdoor space that we have. We sit there every day. We marvel at the beauty of what we have created. We love watching the birds at the feeder. We've greeted many sunsets, and we've loved waiting for and watching the possum, the raccoons, the bats, the skunks, the squirrels, and all of the wildlife that we have in our backyard. I always knew that eventually something would be built on this site, and I don't object to something being built on this site. I'm glad that whatever that it turns out to be, I'm glad that it will have and include affordable housing. But I never imagined that such a preposterously huge and looming and so lacking in consideration of the surrounding neighbors would be what we're facing here. And the thing that makes it so upsetting is that it doesn't have to be that way. It's just too big, too tall, too wide, too close, and too badly designed. So I am asking the ZBA to please, on our behalf, demonstrate that someone is looking out for the citizens of Brookline who appreciate the character of their neighborhoods and the beauty of Brookline's rapidly diminishing open space. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? I know we're, ma'am.
Hello, Yukiko Ueno Igozi, 34 Manchester Road. Yeah, Y-U-K-I-K-O, U-E-N-O, U-E-N-O, E-G-O-Z-Y. 34 Manchester Road. I live in the neighborhood. I wrote a letter expressing my concern about pedestrian safety regarding the site. I do agree with everyone that I believe this proposal it's too big for the site. But I do realize now that the overall number of cars will not change because there will be 30 cars for the site, but the 30 or 45 cars that are there now will go. Regardless, I'm still concerned about the location of the garage. And I would just like to explain that it's about the pedestrians walking on Babcock Street on the even side. That's one. And two is the impact it will have on the crossing of the intersection from Babcock Street and the Freeman Street intersection. So the Babcock Street on the even side is a very wide sidewalk, and it's very popularly used. And from my understanding, the garage opening will be recessed 20 feet, but a setback of the building is 9 feet, so I kind of feel like the visibility of the cars coming out of the garage will be obscured. Right now, the 120 Babcock Street parking garage or driveway kind of pitches down like this. So it happened to me the other day. They kind of drive down like this and take a left onto Babcock, a little fast for my taste. But we can see it because of the 20 feet setback, the cars backing out of their side and then coming down. But if we don't have that setback, I don't think the pedestrians will see the cars coming out in time, and I think that could be potentially dangerous. So then I kind of feel like the garage would need one of those beeping or lights like you would see at the Bank of America ATM in Coolidge Corner or in the Cambridge Side Gallery, and I think that would not be to ensure safety, in my opinion, but I think that would not be appropriate for the neighborhood. That's one. The other issues that, as Ms. Morelli mentioned, there is no official crosswalk at Babcock and Freeman. But because of the geography of our neighborhood, we neighbors use it a lot. To go from our side of the neighborhood, I live on Manchester Road, and if we, in our neighborhood, want to get to, say, the Rose Garden, or say a kid living near the Rose Garden wants to go visit a friend by the Clear Flower Bakery, say, they will come down Freeman Street and cross right at that intersection at Babcock Street, and then turn onto Babcock Street and maybe go down Manchester or Abbotsford. There's really no other way to get from here to there. And then we do this a lot, and it's pretty tricky because if we're going from Freeman and crossing there, there's also the driveway. Well, I mentioned this in the letter, so I won't go on. But anyway, it's heavily used, and now the garage is closer than it's been because it used to be on the edges, but now it's in the middle. And that part of Babcock Street, the road is pretty narrow, so I'm worried that the cars going left off of the garage will sort of meet that intersection and also affect pedestrian safety. So I would request that more studies be done and to ensure the safety. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jen. In fact, we will have one of these hearings will be largely dedicated to traffic and parking.
Hi, my name is Maura Toomey. I live on Cronshield Road. I'm also a town meeting member. I'm not in a butter, but I am here in support of my friends who live in the neighborhood and community. And I just want to make sure that the zoning board, I would hope that the zoning board listens to the realistic and legitimate concerns that these people have. We had a project in our neighborhood, so I know the anxiety and all the issues that this brings up to them, and I just really hope that what they've all spoken to tonight is listened to, and I just want to say I'm here in support of all of my friends who live in the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you. Give us, yeah, ma'am.
Anita Johnson, town meeting member, Precinct 8. Of course, the predominant concern of everyone is the huge size and domination of this building on a relatively small site. But apart from that, it seems like the design of the building is essentially a commercial bordering on industrial design. It has long, flat concrete surfaces. It has no decorative elements between the top of the walls and the roofs. The windows are flat and unattractive. There doesn't seem to be any concern for traditional building elements, and most of all, it is dominated by a garage door. And every time you see a building dominated by a garage door, you have to wonder what is being thought about. Every once in a while, when you drive out to the suburbs, you see houses where the most dominant characteristic is the garage door, and you say, how could anyone ever live in that structure? And that's sort of the way that, in my innocence, I look at this design, which leads me to wonder why, well, I'm not in a position to ask anything, but I hope you will consider asking the designers, if they persist in keeping parking spaces in this building, that they put something attractive, harmonious, and neighborhood-oriented at the front of the building. But moving on to the parking spaces, one of the speakers asked for more parking spaces, and I would ask you to reconsider, well, to think about that proposal. I think the culture is changing about owning a car. I don't think people think it's necessary to own a car anymore. I live in a car-free household, as do other people in this room. It's not only that we're close to the Green Line, it's that people now want to walk, and that people now want to bike, People now want to use an Uber. People now want to use Zipcar. People don't want the hassle of owning a car. People don't want the environmental effects of owning a car. And people don't want the disincentive to healthful physical exercise. So I would ask that you not consider increasing parking spaces, and that, in fact, if it's possible, keep in mind that parking spaces are the least important part of any multifamily housing in North Brookline, and that we should be using that space for affordable units. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Sir.
Good evening. My name is Bob Miller. I live at 19 Copley Street, and I'm also a town meeting member in Precinct 8. I have 2 points that I'd like to make. One is basically to expand on something that Maria Morelli brought up, which is the importance of the visibility of this property from that access that she referred to. And what I really want to just add to that is that there are 3 historic neighborhoods in a very short distance from this property. So the Graf and McKay has been mentioned already. Crown and Shield is also a local historic district, which has houses which are maybe about 100 yards or so from this property. And then the Cottage Farm neighborhood is also right nearby. So also the church that is within that sight line, I believe, that Ms. Morelli showed, is on the National Register. It was the childhood church of John F. Kennedy, and it was preserved despite a 40B proposal which had it being eliminated, and that was because of its historic significance. So this is a historic neighborhood, and this really is a property that has great visibility and will reflect on this neighborhood. So, you know, I think it should be done in a way that addresses that appropriately. The other piece that I wanted to bring up is that in a meeting that we had with Mr. Slater, we being the town meeting members, I believe he stated that the people who live in that house that's surrounded by the L were childhood friends of his. And I suspect that that's why we're not hearing from them in a way that they are concerned. But I suspect that it is the responsibility of the town to recognize that these people may not live in this building forever, and you don't want it to become a decrepit and dilapidated piece of property because of the fact that nobody would want to live in it. And I really wonder, when you look at that shadow rendering, that building, that little structure there is completely surrounded by this building. And I would suggest that even though they're not speaking up, that some consideration be given to, is that property a viable property after this building is built? Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? Sir.
Dave Pantalone, 19 Alton Place, Dave Pantalone, P-A-N-T-A-L-O-N-E, Precinct 7, town meeting member. Listening to all the comments and the discussion tonight, I'm really struck by the argument about economic viability. I remember many weeks ago when I first heard about this project, and I walked down Babcock Street trying to figure out where this was, and I couldn't figure out where it was. I knew it had something to do with the intersection with Freeman Street, and I walked by that intersection. I'm looking around, and there's a beautiful house right across the intersection from Freeman Street, which just fit the character of the neighborhood. It's a beautiful structure. So when I hear this argument, economic viability, the question is premised on the fact that you're tearing down this existing building for the sake of building a new building. So the question seems to be whether building this new building and whether they can get the right number of units and so forth to make it economically viable is all premised on the idea that you're tearing down this beautiful structure that already exists. I'm not sure that's where we should be starting from. Are we saying that this existing property in the existing building, that nobody can afford to own that? I would think that if that was available on the open market, that somebody would be willing to buy a house as characteristic as that in a neighborhood like this. So I just have trouble understanding this whole idea that we are obligated to make a project economically viable when it's premised on destroying something that is a part of the character of the neighborhood in the first place. I don't understand that. But that's my comment, and it's something that's been perplexing me all night long. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? No? I want to thank everyone, and I want to give the applicant an opportunity to comment.
Thank you, and we do appreciate people coming out, and I think it always helps the process. You know, I think in Brookline, we depend a lot on the process. We rely on the process, and I think the planning department has worked hard to set out this 40B process that they believe works, and it has worked in some projects, and arguably the fact that the last couple that I can think of hasn't been appealed, perhaps that means that the process does work. There are some frustrations with the process, though, and you know, some of it is at the very beginning of this process, we were asked to hold back because the planning department had a lot on their plate, and they did have a lot on their plate, so there was a little bit of delay. And now we kind of wait for the peer review, right? And everybody wants, when are you going to make a change, and when are we going to see a change? And we heard things here tonight that we heard 6 weeks ago, and why haven't they reacted to it? Part of it is we do want to get all the peer review. I mean, we have Cliff coming up, we have some traffic coming up, we want to gather all that information. And the one thing that I do want to take exception to is somebody said that they appreciate Maria's coming up here and making the case against this project, right? We don't look at it as a case against this project. We really look at this as the way this process worked. I mean, listen, Maria stood up here for an hour and spoke in great detail about how this project can be improved, and we all took great notes. We have our team here. We listened. Dan Hill did his job. He wants to make sure all the paperwork's correct, and that should be on us. And we need to make sure that the site control, if he's not clear by it, then somebody else might not be clear by it, and it's on us to make sure that it's clear by it to make this board's life easier. So we want to get through this peer review process. The sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned. This board has a life. Planning staff has a life. We all have, we're trying to do this as fast as we can, and my hope is, by the time we get through the peer process and come back to you, perhaps there's something that are great strides to getting to the next step. So it's very difficult when you hear us up here saying, well, do we really want to continue it now, when the deadline's October to December? Well, we'd really like to get the peer review before we get to talking about continuance. And will you pay for a consultant? Well, there's conversations about doing different things to the garage. We want to agree to a consultant now. And so we want to work cooperatively. I think Maria would confirm that we try to work with her closely. And, you know, my client has talked to the neighbors. And arguably, hasn't been as much communication, but I understand that they're frustrated. He's frustrated. We all want to get this peer review and get back to the drawing board. But everything that's brought up here tonight only is going to make this process better. So we want to thank you. We want to thank the neighbors, and especially Maria for the time she's put into that. And thanks, Judy, for laying it all out for us. Okay.
Thanks, Bob. You know, I don't want to jump the gun here, but I think it's important that the board start the conversation of its direction and what it's sort of thinking about in a general sense. Now, we have not had peer review from Cliff Bomer, which is a significant component to our consideration. We have not had our traffic and parking review. That's significant. We've started to hear testimony. We've heard from the neighborhood, and we've heard from town boards and departments. But I think that in a global sense, and without totally committing ourselves, given the fact that we don't have those important peer reviews, I think the board has to start talking. Again, I recognize it's 10-10, but I think the board needs to start talking about global issues that our issues to it based on what's been presented, so that the sense of frustration can start to move in a better direction, where the applicant can start to focus on some of these things that we raise, where the neighborhood gets a better sense of things that we believe are real issues versus things that we think are lesser issues. So, again, I'm recognizing it's 10:10, but I would like to take 5-10 minutes to go around amongst the board members and start to talk about what we've been presented with so far and where we see the weaknesses. Again, reserving our rights based on peer review. You're smiling, Bob.
I agree.
I'm a lawyer. What can I say?
Now, Mr. Chairman, you've laid it out very nicely for us, and I suspect that you have something deeply troubling you inside. I'm going to throw it back to you and say, why don't you start the discussion?
That's fine. Let me say this. I have deep concerns. None of this is going to be shocking. It's largely the issues that were raised by the planning board as distinct from the planning department. It has to do with the size and massing of the structure, the lack of setbacks, front, rear in particular, and those are the two that I focus on. I'm concerned with your focal point being a garage door. I have concerns with the safety of the loading zone. To be candid, and again, we haven't seen, our parking consultant, and I'm not an engineer by any means. That's why I went to law school. I would have looked at this building, and I would have put a nice facade where, for people's use as your front, and I would have put a driveway in and had the entry to a garage off of a driveway from the side. I think the parking ratio is woefully inadequate. I will tell you that I am lesser concerned in general with the height. I am concerned that there are no setbacks. The building doesn't step back to a degree that I think it should. The building doesn't speak remotely to, if you want to use that dirty word, a transitional position. We had this conversation in 40 Center. And I think that this building, even more so than 40 Center, needs to have some kind of language that reflects a more residential neighborhood. 40 Center was, in fact, in a transitional zone between, it's near Beacon Street. This doesn't this doesn't speak that language at all. Now, whether that means the introduction, 40 Center, they introduced, Peter will remember, he's the architect. They introduced something to delineate the entrance to the building to make it feel residential. Whether it means that as a part of step backs you introduce gables, whether you move away from your favorite modernist industrial style appearance. And I know Mr. Slater loves it, and I've commented before, it's not my favorite look. But I think visually the building needs to appear residential and speak better to the neighborhood. So those are some of the things that I see. In particular, let me just jump back to the step back. I think it's important that if we're going to look at a building with a greater height, I don't mean greater than what you've proposed, so I don't want to be confusing about it.
Wait, are you saying, say that again?
I am not suggesting that they increase the height of this
Okay,
building.
thank you.
I want to be very clear. But even if you're talking about moving the building away from the neighbors in the rear yard, I am conscious of the fact that they're a story below you. And I'm concerned about how that reads, both in terms of shadowing and just in terms of lifestyle. So I think that that's a communication of, if you're going to look into stepping the building back in a significant fashion, and by the way, I'm not dismissing, I'm waiting to hear Cliff's report, because I suspect one of the things he's going to suggest is that you do something greater than simply stepping it back. I suspect he's going to say removal of a floor, but I want to hear what he has to say. But if you're going to step back the building, which I think you need to do as it gets higher, I think you in particular need to step it back from that rear lot line. I will also be straight with you on one more topic, which is I am less concerned about the large apartment structure from facing the building to the left. That's not my major concern here. So, in fairness, I'm giving you a few clues where my mindset is. Anybody else want to say something?
No, I think you've said it all, Mr. Chairman. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Don't you want to point at me? No. Mark?
I will add this. When I see the building in renderings, I see Lawrence, Lowell, Fall River. I see a mill building, and I don't think it fits into the context of the neighborhood at all. And I'm looking at that rendering without thinking about the context of the neighborhood itself. I'm just looking at the building and saying it's not residential, it's industrial. It looks like you could drive a truck into the front and drop off raw metal material for making bicycles or whatever. That being said,
License plates.
License plate, well, no. I won't go that far. I do agree with most of Chairman Geller's assessment as far as recommendations for fitting it more into the context of the neighborhood in terms of size, making some reasonable alterations to the facade of the building so that it does not look like an industrial building. As far as the garage being there, I mean, I'm not an architect, I'm not a designer. I agree that there could be a better way for having a drop-off station, maybe it's not a loading zone. I think that I've heard from the developer, maybe from the planning board, that there are elements of this design that are fungible, that the developer is open to making some changes. And so I don't want to condemn the developer. I do want to commend Maria for her very detailed presentation. I was actually astounded by how you kept on point. That's great. And I think everybody heard you, and you got a lot of applause, but we're here, obviously, Mr. Allen, you know, we're here to help the neighborhood, to help the developer work together toward a mutually agreeable solution. And I will take part in this, hoping that we will reach a mutually agreeable solution. So we'll hear from other peer developers, and we'll have more information to make recommendations. But
I agree with everything my colleagues have said, and wish I could say it all again to emphasize how strongly I agree. Setbacks at least 20 feet. Open space has to be there. It's the intensity, not density, it's just the intensity. There's just too much there. Mr. Bartash, I know you have more in your wheelhouse than the 3 or 4 buildings you have shown us in Brookline. We just need you to break it up more. Show us what you've got. And
sell it.
Yeah, right. And give us an
There's a
articulation.
pink lady in there somewhere.
So, yeah, spend some time in Martha's Vineyard and come back. But you've got to soften it and give us more of the vernacular of the historic neighborhoods that you are bringing this important building into. It's true, as Maria said, you're looking down a big street, and it's going to have a big impact in that area. Oh, in terms of the loading zone, obviously, everyone's saying get rid of that. And again, I'm not an architect, but the idea I had is you have the bigger setback, why not have a circle driveway in front of the building, which can also make it have a more portico-like entrance, and truck could just drive off, dump stuff off, and the parking lot can have the entrance from the side.
Let's start with the discussion of whether it's necessary, and then we can work from there.
Anyway, I thought I'd give you a benefit of my brilliant idea.
We're all frustrated architects up here.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm sure,
Well, actually,
I'm sure Tara had an entrance like that, so that's all I have to say.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me also touch on a subject that Bob Allen touched on, which is every project is different. But from my past experience on a matter with this same developer, and based on the expressions of the developer when he was here for the first hearing, he has expressed that he does want to work with the town boards, with the ZBA, and with the neighbors. That doesn't mean he's going to do everything that everybody asks of him. But my experience is that he does work with people, and there are some developers who do not. And I will take it on faith that he means it. So, again, that may not mean you get what you want, but I think he's willing to have the conversation from what I've seen. So, that helps. I heard what you said. Okay. Where are we with additional materials? 3D model in SketchUp, stamp on the site plan, and we just wanted to make sure that the traffic study is based on existing conditions rather than the maybe proposal for Babcock Street. You're going to follow up with that? Okay. Our next hearing is August 23rd, 7 p.m. It is our intention at that hearing that we will at that time hear from Cliff Bomer, who is our site and building design peer reviewer. There is an outside chance, is that a fair term, that we may also at that time hear traffic peer review? And if we don't hear traffic peer review, and parking, R2? Yes. Okay, and also parking. There is a chance, well, if we do not hear traffic and parking peer review on the 28th, it will be at the following hearing to
Do
that.
we know what that following hearing date is?
23rd will be on the 28th.
23rd?
Yep, we're going to try to have traffic, parking, and site and building
Oh,
design
right.
on the 23rd.
Right, I was reading my wrong note.
So if-
Next hearing is the 23rd, 7 p.m., and the one that follows that is the 28th, 7 p.m.
Do we have a whole calendar kind of laid out, or are we not beyond the 28th yet?
So because there are people on vacation right now, I can't confirm the 23rd for traffic and parking, and that's why I penciled in the 28th as a backup. But clearly, I would like to do a schedule for the whole 180 days, just so you could see how tight the
Yes.
schedule is.
I can, yeah, okay.
There will be, well, time is always there's always a function of time. There will be an opportunity for future neighborhood testimony. If it's not at the next hearing, it would be at the following hearing, but there will be further opportunities for testimony.
Feel free to encourage people to submit written comments.
Thank you. Allison says I should encourage people to submit written comments. Thank you, everyone. Adjourn. We are continued. We are adjourned.
Should we take a vote to continue?
I move that we adjourn this until August 23rd. Oh, please.
You want to second it? All in favor? Everybody says aye.